What was that? Boylston.
Welcome to the Boston Unbombing. How and why the Boston Marathon bombing was a staged false flag event. For those of you who don't know, a false flag is a covert operation which is designed to appear as if it has been carried out by political enemies, and which is used as a pretext to start a war or to enact draconian laws in the name of national security. A false flag can be an event of real violence, or as in the case of the Boston Marathon unbombing, it can be an event of make-believe violence. In either case, the ultimate objective is the same. Before proceeding, I have two introductory passages to read with some commentary. The first is a reading from the Gospel of Matthew. Jesus said, "Lo, I send you forth as sheep in the midst of wolves. Be ye therefore wise as the serpents and simple as the doves." I'm starting with this passage because it's a warning given by the man from Galilee himself about being naive. Don't be naive. Beware of the con artists. Beware of the wolves. Do be simple, but also be wise. And now a reading from the Gospel of Progressivism, the Gospel of the Wolves. Verily, verily, the ends justify the means. Historically speaking, progressivism is the philosophy that calls using the state to control every aspect of your life progress. A more clear word for what I'm talking about is statism. Statism is firstly authoritarianism. The adherents of statism are arrogant and entitled authoritarians. They are the pseudo-liberals and neoconservatives in government, and are also found amongst the upper echelons of all large institutions that act in collusion with governmental authoritarians. The kind of control to which they believe they are entitled extends right to your perception of reality, which is why they lie. They lie and con and deceive and launch wars and proxy wars and displace populations with impunity, because the jury of their peers always finds them justified. They are complete materialists, and the day we stop believing their lies is the day we begin on a long overdue spiritual and cultural renaissance. End of sermon. Here we go. The official story is that two bombs were exploded within 12 seconds of each other near the finish line of the Boston Marathon on the afternoon of April 15, 2013. We'll start our investigation with an overview of the scene. Most of my presentation will deal with the first explosion site near the finish line because there is so much more photographic and video footage of the first site than of the second site. But I will cover some aspects of the scene at the second explosion. Also, this is the last slide in which I will use the word explosion for what occurred that day. From hereafter, I will be saying pyrotechnic display. Here's another view from directly overhead. Here's another view, looking up to the medical tent from the finish line, which has a little bridge looking over it. Here's a view from just a few steps past the finish line, incidentally taken at 5 minutes and 44 seconds after the pyrotechnic display. You can see the white medical tent up the block and also see some empty wheelchairs on the side under the viewing bridge. Concerning the proximity of medical responders and equipment, an important fact to note is that according to a FEMA assessment of the Boston Marathon so-called bombing, there was no lack of wheelchairs or stretchers near the scene. The report says, quote, volunteers and bystanders used over 100 wheelchairs and stretchers positioned around the finish line to transport victims to the medical tent. Okay, this is a view from the finish line camera. The time of this picture is almost 2 hours after the winner crossed the finish line, and yet here a group of cameramen are eagerly poised at the finish line. The video I'm about to play shows the first pyrotechnic display, occurring just as the finish line clock changes from 4:09:43 to 4:09:44. These pictures show us some mainstream media cameramen at work soon after the pyrotechnic display. The only images of this event that the vast majority of the public has ever seen have come from mainstream media sources. The major source of both photographic and video footage comes from the Boston Globe. Additional mainstream footage comes from Fox News, ABC, NBC, and CBS, and a few professional freelance photographers. There were a few non-professionals and non-insiders who approached the scene and took some cell phone video or photos before being driven away by shouting police or by shouting bystanders. There were also 2 people who took many photos from nearby windows, one from more or less above the scene and another from down the street a distance. In the next 2 slides, I'm going to introduce the 2 sets of photographs taken from the nearby windows. This is the first of the Thorndike set of photos. Altogether, there are 26 photos, and they capture 2 through 14 seconds after the pyrotechnic display near the finish line. This image is taken from the Aaron Tang, or Haha Tango, which is his Flickr moniker, set of photos, which were taken from a window farther away than the Thorndike vantage. There are about 65 photos in the Aaron Tang set, which captured the scene near the finish line, from 19 seconds to over 20 minutes after the pyrotechnic display. This is just to show you the locations of Thorndike and Haha Tango. This is the only photo I've found taken from a window on the other side of the scene. This photo captures exactly 1 minute and 38 seconds after the first pyrotechnic display, before anyone was taken out of the area by wheelchair or by stretcher. Note that there is actually not a lot of people on the scene in this photo. Altogether, at the first pyrotechnic site, there were 27 victims lying or sitting down on the ground, appearing to be injured. Not all of them clearly visible in this photo, of course. Plus, there were a number of people who stayed standing and walking around at the site and were later reported as injured. Plus, there were a number of people who ran away from the site very soon after the pyrotechnic display, or possibly were never near the site at all and were later reported as injured. And at the second pyrotechnic display site, a block down the street, there was a much smaller amount of victims. We will soon be discovering that all of these victims are actually crisis actors. Now, when I say crisis actors, I don't mean professional actors or professional crisis actors. I mean people of various professions and walks of life who were recruited to be crisis actors in this particular event. Though most of our focus will be on the first site, here is the site of the second pyrotechnic display, which is a block further back from the finish line than the first site. The alleged epicenter of the alleged blast, aka Ground Zero, in this picture is between the tree and the dark green mailbox. This photo was taken 13 seconds after the second pyrotechnic display. The picture is grainy, but there are several so-called victims on the ground between the mailbox and the tree. There are several more to the left of the tree and behind the barricade fencing on the left. Altogether, there's around a dozen so-called victims near Ground Zero in this scene. But the stage of the second pyrotechnic site was wider than just the immediate area around Ground Zero. By the time this photo was taken, there were a number of so-called victims who were taken away or ran away from the immediate area of Ground Zero. Plus, there are some so-called victims who show up in the media footage who were probably never close to Ground Zero at all. From all the available footage, there are no more than 24 crisis actor victims on the entire stage of the second pyrotechnic display, which is to say nothing of their accomplices, the crisis actor heroes, the people who played the roles of the uninjured helpers. So, the official story is that there were 264 people injured at the Boston so-called bombing, but in reality they kept the number of crisis actor victims a lot smaller than that. The number of crisis actor victims between both sites was somewhere around 70 people, and I should mention that quite a few of them appear to have missed out on the injury makeup and fake blood. Anyhow, there was certainly nowhere near 264 crisis actor victims, and there was 0 real victims, because the entire event and all its transpirings was not real. But before we go into the particular transpirings of the Boston unbombing, we have to have full context. so I'm going to shift gears for a few moments. The first thing you need to know is that the Boston unbombing was, in a nutshell, a disaster preparedness drill gone live. Meaning that the Boston unbombing was carried out by people within various federal and local government agencies that have been involved in running mega disaster preparedness drills across America for years now. But what's the use of telling you that the Boston unbombing was a large disaster drill gone live if you don't know what a large disaster drill looks like and what types of participants and props and effects are typically in use therein? In order to have the necessary context, we have to go over some of the basic elements of large disaster and emergency response training drills. So here we go. Even crisis actors get a coffee break. These are crisis actors at a recent large disaster drill in England. Fake wounds and fake gore are called moulage in the special effects industry and are an element of hyper-realistic emergency response drills. Moulage is our word for the day. Here's some more media coverage of the same drill in England. Lots of actors, lots of moulage. That cut leg looks like it hurts. Moulage is an art. Here's an amateur homemade moulage wound, made of various silicones and putties and paints. The funny comment says she's going to pick the kids up from school with that on her arm. Not bad for an amateur. Now let's see some work from the pros. Pretty realistic and pretty gross. This is professional work by the UK-based firm Trauma FX. Gag me with a spoon. And more from Trauma FX. Grody to the max. And more from Trauma Effects, using an amputee crisis actor. I really don't like looking at this. This is just a palate cleanser after that last image. This is an advertisement for silicone sleeves with prefabricated wounds. Silicone sleeves and silicone skin wraps and silicone patches are common elements in emergency response drills, as well as movie special effects makeup. Here's a different silicone sleeve you can buy from the same company. Collect all 12. But you should also get a fake blood pump kit if you're going to do the job professionally. Notice in the picture at the top that the fake wound is bleeding. Of course it is. Bleeding is an important part of trauma simulation. Why not visit Etsy and get yourself a silicone trauma simulation sleeve with a dynamic bleeding tube included? As the description says, this sleeve works with a HydraSim. And here's the HydraSim trauma bleeding simulation system. It's basically a small pack containing a fake blood supply and a pumping mechanism and some tubes. The ad reads, "A rugged, realistic, and affordable solution to the chaos caused by external hemorrhage." The 3 photos at the bottom are a few of the more sophisticated fake bleeding rigs on the market. Some of them are battery operated. The photo at the top is an emergency training company advertising the simulation effect of fake blood squirting frighteningly from a fake leg wound. You might have noticed the word squib under one of the pictures here. Squib is a word used for fake blood packets in the field of trauma simulation and also in the movie special effects industry. Any professional emergency response drill or military drill makes use of fake blood in a variety of forms: blood capsules, blood sponges, blood syringes, and blood squibs. A simple blood squib is a pouch designed to break with impact, and we've already seen some of the more complex squibs on the market. There are all kinds of squibs using various kinds of pump and tube assemblies. This is an article from Fox News about the benefits of hyper-realistic medical emergency training. The article reads, quote, "Makeup artists create combat wounds that bleed actively from hidden tubes," unquote. At the right is a still frame from the video accompanying this article, and it shows a crisis actor using the fake blood delivery system. I'm sure you get the point by now. But here's another product that includes a tube that sends fake blood squirting out of a gruesome moulage wound. Of course, you'd probably want to hide the tube a bit better than that in a disaster drill or a trauma simulation drill. Now, if you're doing an emergency drill, you don't really need a super-duper realistic silicone moulage sleeve. nor would you need a particularly deceptively hidden fake blood tube delivery system. The photo at the top is a demo of a fake blood tube simply tucked under a flesh-colored sleeve and simulating bleeding through some holes in the sleeve. That wouldn't pass in a Hollywood movie. The silicone sleeve on the bottom, on the other hand, is quite convincing. You can hardly see the edges. Sneak a fake blood tube under there, and you're ready for the big screen. As for the Boston unbombing was not quite ready for the big screen. Remember I told you about the Thorndike set of photos? This is Thorndike 7, capturing 5 seconds after the pyrotechnic display. Now we'll magnify the area of the picture where the blue arrow is pointing. This fellow is a crisis actor named Eric Whaley, who according to the official story had his pants blown off by a shrapnel-filled bomb. We see no evidence from this angle that his legs are bleeding. We do, however, see an anomalous line all the way across the top of his left thigh, which is direct evidence, as several more photographs over the next several slides will prove, that he is wearing a thin silicone sleeve over his upper left thigh. The photo on the right has the contrast enhanced in order to see the line on his thigh more clearly. Just to help you out, on the photo on the left I drew a blue line over the line across his thigh. Just to be extra clear, the area now colored green is where the silicone sleeve is pulled up over his upper thigh. Okay, please understand that I'm not asking you to come to a conclusion from this photo alone. I will soon be showing you other photos, including a very clear high-resolution close-up of this silicone sleeve over his upper thigh, with a fake blood tube under it. But our purposes for now are just to establish that this line around his leg was there immediately after the pyrotechnic display. Here's another photo showing us another angle. Yet again his legs aren't bleeding, and now we see from another angle that the same line that we saw across the top of his thigh is also going around his inner thigh. So we know it is something he is wearing around his leg. As we've established, silicone sleeves and coverings are commonly used in the field of special effects makeup. But of course we should be asking all the logical questions at this point. We should ask if this line is some kind of shrapnel gash across his leg. But if that was the case, then he would be bleeding here at 5 seconds after the pyrotechnic display. And he is not bleeding, and that line across his leg is not a wound. He rolls around a bit, and we don't get too many good pictures of this leg in the Thorndike set, and this one is a bit out of focus, but nonetheless it clearly shows us again that anomalous line on his left thigh. This picture was taken several minutes later. Now Mr. Whaley has been moved several feet away from where he was, and he is in the process of being tended to by the first responder special effects makeup team. And there's that same line around his left thigh. I put a close-up on the upper right and a close-up with contrast enhanced on the lower right. Now for the kids in the back of the class, I'll draw a blue line over the line around his leg. There it is. And there it is, clear as day. Notice how the large red stain is coming from under that line on his thigh. That is because the fake blood is pouring from under the silicone skin covering or sleeve. There is a tube under that sleeve, and it is connected to a hidden blood squib. If you look at where the white arrow is pointing on the close-up, you can see an anomalous round indentation under the sleeve on the back of his thigh, which looks just like the end of a tube, because it is. I'll put a blue highlight on the indentation and then take it off. There it is. And there you have it, clear as day. By the way, I promise that the vast majority of this multifaceted presentation will not be images of moulage and fake blood and gore. We'll actually be done with the real gross pictures in just a few minutes. Alright, here's another photo of Mr. Whaley, which provides more conclusive evidence. Here we see the same anomalous line from another angle on both sides of the back of his thigh, and the same evidence of red staining on only one side of that crisp line, which is only possible if the stain was flowing out from under that line. Mind you, this man has been rolling around every which way with his leg up and down and in all directions, including the bend that is pictured here. So, if there was a real wound on the back of his thigh, then the blood should be and should have been pouring down his upper thigh towards his butt whenever his thigh was raised like this. But the blood hasn't done so, and instead we see a clean line of demarcation, because fake blood is pouring from under a flesh-colored silicone sleeve, which is a commonplace element of both trauma simulation and cinema special effects. Now this photo is several minutes after the previous photo, and Mr. Whaley has been moved into a wheelchair. As with the advertisement we looked at earlier for the trauma effects sleeve, the edge of this sleeve is difficult to discern from certain angles, but we still clearly see the edge of the sleeve at the back of his thigh, and also that a bit of the fake blood flowing out from under the sleeve has now spilled over the edge. I should mention here that Mr. Whaley wasn't the only person at the Boston unbombing with a fake blood tube tucked under his pants. This gruesome photo was circulated widely within hours after the Boston so-called bombing. The crisis actor in the top center of this photo is Jeff Bauman, who was already a double amputee before the unbombing. We clearly see the end of a tube coming out of the back of his pants. At the bottom right of this photo I've included a cropped and magnified portion of this photo showing the tube. We even see a bit of blood splatter right at the end of the tube. We will investigate Jeff very in depth later in this presentation, but I also want to point out here that there is no tourniquet on Jeff's clearly visible leg in this photo, which was taken almost exactly 3 minutes after the pyrotechnic display. The plentiful photographic and video evidence reveals as a fact that there was one medical doctor and one paramedic bending over Jeff at exactly 1 minute after the pyrotechnic display, and that at 2 minutes and 11 seconds after, there was exactly 3 medical doctors and 1 paramedic standing in a circle around Jeff and looking at him intently. And yet here is Jeff in this photo at 3 minutes after, and no one has managed to put a tourniquet on his leg. The official story is that a cowboy hat-wearing Latino man named Carlos got to Jeff before anybody else did, and was the first to put tourniquets on Jeff's legs before throwing Jeff into the first available wheelchair and helping to run Jeff off to the medical tent. But the official story is complete and utter bullshit. Again, this photo of Jeff lying on the sidewalk was taken at 3 minutes after the pyrotechnic display, and they actually left Jeff on the sidewalk here for another full 3 minutes after this photo, while wheelchairs came and went, and I mean wheelchairs were brought directly to Jeff and Carlos and were then put back on the curb empty, to wait and wait until Jeff's moulage was fine-tuned and ready for the big photo op. Which is as much as I'll say for now, because this will be covered in a very thorough and in-depth investigation of Jeff and Cowboy Carlos later in this presentation. But we haven't bid a proper farewell to Mr. Whaley of the silicone thigh sleeve yet, so here's one last picture of him, here going back to the Thorndike set at 4 seconds after the pyrotechnic display. The picture is hazy, but it shows that the back of his legs are not a bloody, mangled mess. Again, the official story is that a shrapnel bomb blew off his pants at close range. But it is impossible that the shrapnel blasting out at close range and at great speed and force would leave his legs so clean. Okay, now we will move on to another crisis actor who demonstrates exactly what a shrapnel bomb cannot do to clothes and skin. Mr. Whaley wasn't the only person who lost his pants at the Boston unbombing. A sure sign of unreality in this event is all the people who had clothing torn off, according to the official story, by a shrapnel-filled blast, and yet their skin remained unbleeding. The guy in the middle of this picture with the shredded clothes I call Running Boy. According to the official story, both of his pant legs and one of his shirt sleeves have been torn off by a shrapnel-filled bomb, and that which is left of his pants and shirt have been quite shredded, and yet he has no bleeding shrapnel wounds on his legs or arms or torso or face or anywhere else. Here we see one absolutely non-bleeding scratch mark on the side of his lower left leg. This guy is not bleeding. he would have suffered real and horrific injuries from a real pressure cooker bomb filled with gunpowder and BBs and nails and other shrapnel. Such a bomb falls under the category of a low-order explosive bomb. If you are close enough to such a bomb to lose any clothing, then you are literally in the zone of fire, in the literally fiery thermal burning zone, and you are also in the direct line of shrapnel fire, which is like getting shot by many BB guns at once, but much, much worse. You are not in your safe space. Looking good. Looking ridiculous. Again, if a shrapnel-filled bomb really tore apart and shredded this guy's pants, his legs would be bleeding heavily, and he would be in very bad shape. So far, we saw 1 scratch mark and 0 bleeding. His lower back doesn't look injured. No burns there. Sure don't look burned. Now we see he's taken the shredded shirt off and he's in a black t-shirt. And there he goes. Run away, running boy. Now, would you believe that Running Boy's injuries include severe burns to his left arm and lower back and multiple shrapnel wounds to both of his legs and his left arm, resulting in multiple procedures to pull all the projectiles out of his body? Me neither. But those are his reported injuries. His identity is actually not a mystery. His name is Kyle Larrow, and there's a bunch of mainstream media articles about him being a Boston Marathon bombing victim. Of course, those articles were not accompanied by the pictures we just saw, but he is, in fact, Running Boy. At the upper right is a picture of Running Boy, aka Kyle Larrow, being attended to by some cops later that day. At the lower left is a picture of him from a Harvard baseball team video. Same guy. I should also mention that when he was a kid, he was a cast member of a TV show called Zoom, which I only mention because in this picture of his Zoom days, he's making exactly the same face as he is in the picture above it. Don't worry, Running Boy. We know you're not the bomber. Okay, before the next piece of direct evidence, we're going to revisit the art of moulage. Here's an example of the artistic process from a moulage specialist, a wound built on a silicone sleeve that is wrapped around a limb. The finished result here looks pretty good, though it is just a demo and not too fine-tuned. Even when it's done well, the essential problem is that rubbery look. That's a problem whether it's a silicone sleeve or patch or an entire fake limb made of silicone. There are a whole array of blood gels and blood paint additives to mitigate the problem of fake blood unnaturally beading up on silicone. I can relate. As a house painter, I learned the hard way that paint only beads up on pure silicone caulk. Anyhow, the point is that the state of the art of moulage is still not quite like reality, and even the pro work looks rubbery and unnatural under close scrutiny. Like this photo, for instance, of the lower leg of a crisis actor at the Boston unbombing. The whole area around the wound has that rubbery silicone look. Not only is the wound fake, but in fact the whole lower leg is fake. The wound is part of a silicone prosthetic attachment, and the crisis actor wearing the prosthetic was already an amputee prior to the Boston unbombing. To be more precise, this photo is a still frame from a video. The video was taken at the scene by another crisis actor, pictured on the bottom right with his camera in hand, at the scene near the finish line a few minutes after the pyrotechnic display. For almost 2 years after the unbombing, this footage was unseen by the public, thus escaping the initial flurry of scrutiny and investigation in the weeks and months after the event. The fact that such blatant evidence of fraud was ever released at all is a testament to man's perennial hubris. I know this wound is fake not only because it looks completely fake to me, but because I also showed this image to a trauma surgeon and asked their opinion. Though I'm not at liberty to disclose this person's identity, They told me that it looked ridiculous and specifically mentioned the unrealistic rubbery look, the unrealistic rolled edges on the sides of the wound, and the unrealistic way that the fake flesh is torn. But we don't have to rely on hearsay or anyone's word for it to be absolutely sure that this wound is fake, because we can directly prove from the early Thorndike photos that this wound is fake, so let's do that now. Here are two photos showing the same fake lower leg wound at 8 and 9 seconds after the pyrotechnic display. These photos are magnified portions of two photos from the Thorndike set. If this wound were real, then the medical impossibility displayed in these photos would be that this very severely wounded lower leg is not bleeding. Thorndike photos 6 through 17 show that this lower leg stayed at the same spot for at least 6 seconds, in which we see that the wound is not bleeding at all, and also that the pavement on both sides of this wounded lower leg does not have any blood on it at all, when in reality there would have had to be a large amount of blood spilling onto the pavement. Zooming out a bit, I want to point out that the girl with the fake lower leg wound, whose name is Rebecca Gregory, by the way, isn't the only person in this area who should be bleeding heavily onto the ground, but is not doing so. According to the official story, the man at the left side of these photos, with the white hair and the red jacket, named Bill White, suffered a severe lower right leg wound, so bad that doctors had to amputate his lower right leg. He should be bleeding all over the ground. Look at the ground around his leg in the bottom photo. It is 11 seconds after the blast, and no blood. To make matters more ridiculous, notice in the top 3 photos the guy wearing shorts standing up in the middle. Actually, I should say the guy wearing partial pants, because his pants are supposed to have been blown partially off by a shrapnel-filled bomb. Anyhow, notice how in the top photos his right leg is right next to the right leg of Bill White at the left. The official story is that this guy in the middle, named Pete DiMartino, just had 90% of his right Achilles tendon blown off by the alleged bomb. Notice in the bottom photo when Pete moves his leg away that he should have bled all over the ground in the same area where Bill White should also be bleeding all over the ground, but isn't bleeding. Because the official story is a lie. Also, consider that if a shrapnel-filled bomb really shredded Pete's pants off of his legs, then he should be bleeding heavily from multiple areas of his legs. You can see in the bottom photo that Pete did manage to wipe some fake blood on his leg, but the irrefutable telltale evidence is that no one has bled onto the ground here. Eventually, however, Bill White does manage to spread some fake blood onto and around his leg, as we shall document momentarily. So back to Bill White. In the photos at the top, we see at 12 seconds after the blast that Bill reaches his hand down to his right leg, which as of yet is not in a puddle of blood, and then at the photo at the bottom, we see that when he pulls his hand away, there is finally blood, at 13 or 14 seconds after the blast. Again, the official story is that his lower right leg was severely wounded. The problem, and the medical impossibility, is that there was no blood for the first 12 seconds. The explanation is that Bill has been supplied with a blood squib. Every crisis actor in this false flag event was supplied with various blood squibs and blood capsules. There were also several moulage makeup artists on the scene, who in addition to setting up and fine-tuning the fake wounds and fake blood, were also busy dousing the ground in fake blood. Moving on, these photos are magnifications of a photo showing us a young female crisis actress being wheeled away on a stretcher from the first pyrotechnic site. I've placed a blue arrow on the photo which points directly at a silicone moulage sleeve or covering that has been placed over and partially around her left leg, and not very well placed at that. The pictures at the right are a further magnified section of the photo, with contrast adjusted at the bottom right for better clarity. I'll briefly highlight the edges of the silicone moulage sleeve covering with blue lines. There it is. And there it is, clear as day. The light blue arrow is pointing at it. The photographer just happened to be at an angle to catch it. The red arrow is pointing to part of her real leg, and you can clearly see that part of her real leg is disappearing under the right side of the silicone moulage covering, and you can also see down by the shin of the leg that there is a wide gap between the bottom of the silicone covering and the lower leg that it has been placed over. This is a very blatant example of fake injury props in use. Zoomed out to the full picture, we see that this photo was taken while the stretcher was still near the sidewalk curb. They will do a little further moulage adjustment before they make their dash across the finish line towards the medical tent. Now they are crossing the finish line. After the adjustment and from other camera angles, the silicone covering is not noticeable, though having seen it we can now spot some anomalous outlines at the close-up on the bottom right. By the way, this crisis actress is named Crystal Campbell, and the official story is that she died that day. But in reality, nobody died at the Boston unbombing. For the next several slides, I'm going to focus on evidence of clothing cut in a scissors or razor type way, with unbleeding skin underneath, which is impossible to be the result of a shrapnel bomb. For starters, here's a real oddball from the second pyrotechnic site. This fellow is named Bim Costello. The vertical cuts in his shirt are ridiculous. Real bomb shrapnel goes through fabric, making holes in clothing, and results in much traumatic bleeding when it does so. Shrapnel does not cut a shirt like scissors, but scissors do. His pants are supposed to be blown apart by a shrapnel-filled bomb, but while he is marked up, there is zero sign of him actually bleeding. This photo is just ridiculous. Speaking of clothing being cleanly sheared, here is a photo from the first pyrotechnic site. Here we see a fat lady in a purple shirt exiting the scene less than a half a minute after the pyrotechnic display, with scissors in her hand. The woman in the red shirt next to her is her accomplice. I call them the cutting crew. Here's a close-up. In this photo, the scissors are closed. In the next photo, they're open. This guy has recently met with some scissors. The two photos on the left are from the Thorndike set, and we see this fellow's pants neatly sliced open just a few seconds after the pyrotechnic display. The two photos on the right are from Ha Ha Tango and show him minutes later displaying the tailoring for a cop. He told ABC News that his jeans were blown apart by a bomb. His name is Colton Kilgore. Yes, I see the reddish color of his right leg on the picture at the right, and I've already established that fake blood abounded that day. It is the absolutely kooky, crazy cutting of his pants that I'm pointing out as an impossible result of a shrapnel bomb. Let's listen to him.
I am, and as you can see, there are my jeans that were blown apart, and this is the strip that I was trying to tear off to use as a tourniquet.
Still Boston strong, he hopes his testimony painted a picture of the bloodshed.
You know, it was really an honor to get to represent my fellow survivors.
Punk? Okay, so he actually wants us to believe that his jeans were blown apart like this by a shrapnel bomb. Again, in the photos at the bottom, we see in the Thorndike pictures from around 6 seconds after the pyrotechnic display that ridiculous cut in his jeans, with no bleeding skin underneath. Moving on, I want to briefly point out the unfortunate soul who was underneath the fat purple lady in the first two photos from the Thorndike set. It's this woman under the white arrow. Here's what she told the Boston Herald.
My shoes were blown right off and part of my jean, but my glasses stayed on, and we had that blanket.
Okay, ripped jeans are a fashion, so I wouldn't assume anything, but she herself says that a shrapnel-filled bomb blew off part of her jeans. But even more bizarre is her statement that a bomb blew off her shoes, and yet apparently her feet were not affected. Maybe instead of shrapnel, the bomb sent out a fat lady with scissors and an appetite for sneakers. Here's another crisis actor sporting a ridiculous scissors or razor type cut in his jeans with totally clean, unbleeding skin underneath. Obviously not a fashion statement. These are still frames from ABC News footage. This guy is being wheeled out of the first pyrotechnic site. Here's a photo of a crisis actor at the second pyrotechnic site. The mainstream media blocked out her lower right leg, but we see some silly scissors cuts in her lower left pants leg. Shrapnel bombs simply don't cut clothes like this. And of course we see that the skin underneath the silly scissors cut is not bleeding. Now this is supposed to be very soon after the pyrotechnic display, and the guy applying the tourniquet is supposed to be her heroic first responder. No medical professionals have been cutting her clothes for any reason at this point. Let's investigate the larger, ridiculous story to these characters. This is the first photo we see of them, about 1 minute and 5 seconds after the second pyrotechnic display. The official story is that this guy, named Shore Salter, heroically rescued this woman, named Roseanne Sedoya. You can see the mailbox and the tree back on the sidewalk. That's ground zero of the second pyrotechnic site. Now this guy somehow moved this lady from the scene on the sidewalk to this spot in the street. Here we see them standing there for a moment before he lays her down and applies a brown belt tourniquet to her leg, as we shall see in the next slide. The official story is that her leg was massively wounded by shrapnel and that she was, in her own words, bleeding very, very badly. At the right is a cropped and magnified image of her legs from the same photo at left, with the exposure lightened for clarity. There is definitely no belt tourniquet on her leg as of yet, which proves that this woman and man are total fakers, because it is impossible that she would be standing there with a massive shrapnel wound grotesquely contorting her leg, with no blood pouring out of her leg onto the ground. I should mention that according to the official story, her leg was medically amputated when she got to the hospital. But her leg is careful not to bleed on the clean Boston street here. Another point to ponder is that this guy allegedly carried her to this spot, and yet his sleeves are still perfectly white. What she really needed was one of those fancy battery-operated blood squibs with the pump and the tube that you can tuck under your pants. The two photos on the right are the only photos I could find of this guy applying the tourniquet to this woman. Both photos have been cropped this way by the mainstream media, and again, in the lower right, her leg wound has also been blacked out by the mainstream media. But we see enough to be certain that they are out in the middle of the street, which you can tell from the white crosswalk paint and the metal barrier fencing visible in the top right photo. In both photos we can see that the brown belt tourniquet is being applied. Again, the photo on the left is them standing there with no tourniquet, and yet she is not bleeding onto the ground, by which we can conclude that our hero and damsel in distress are nothing more than two unfortunate victims of the governmental con artists who have convinced them to participate in this elaborate fraud. As long as we're at the second pyrotechnic site, here's something else that demonstrates a hoax in action, and that is a lower leg from which a foot has been amputated and yet does not bleed onto the ground. The leg belongs to Paul Norden. The photo at the left is 20 seconds after the second pyrotechnic display, and if this were real, then by now there would have to be a huge puddle of blood under that missing foot on the sidewalk and the sidewalk curb. The photo on the right is 45 seconds after, and we can see that his leg stayed at the same area by its proximity to the railing and the red and white sign and the stormwater drain, and also to the plastic yellow bottle on the street by the curb. Like Roseanne, Paul Norden had some fake blood smeared on his leg, but there is no sign of him actually bleeding onto the ground. In reality, by 20 seconds after, let alone by 45 seconds after, there would simply have to be a very large puddle of blood on the ground all over the area under and around his missing foot. But the reality is that the event was a fake staged hoax. Moving on, here's another ridiculous lie from the official story. This is the account given by a fellow named Bruce Mendelson, who claimed he was knocked off a couch by the blast wave while he was inside a nearby third-floor office. Quote, "A blast wave immediately blew me off the couch upon which I was sitting and onto the floor." Here's where Mendelsohn was relative to the pyrotechnic display. This same story is repeated on his Storify blog. Quote, "A blast wave blew me off the couch upon which I was sitting and onto the floor." Bruce's story is beyond ludicrous. The official story is that the pressure cooker bomb was loaded with black powder, also called gunpowder, which is categorized as a low explosive or low-order explosive. Low explosives, when used in a pressure cooker bomb, can be horrifically destructive, but they simply do not generate the kind of blast that can knock you off a couch inside a third-floor office at the distance Mendelsohn claims to have been. On the other hand, high-energy explosive materials create a supersonic blast wave of pressurized air that can knock people down at a distance well beyond the incendiary zone. If there had been a high-order explosive detonation, then yes, there would have been a huge knock-you-down blast wave, and there would have also been a crater in the sidewalk and a wide ring of dead bodies around the detonation site. God forbid. Just by analyzing the footage, you can see that plenty of people who were actually close to the pyrotechnic remained standing. Both of these images are from 1 second after the pyrotechnic display. Lots of people on the sidewalk are still standing. Why didn't all the people in the street get knocked over by a blast wave? No one on the street fell over excepting one old fellow named Bill Ifrig, who was a member of the crisis actor crew. As for Bruce Mendelsohn up in his third-floor office, Bruce Mendelsohn, you're fired. Actually, there was also a guy over in the bleachers who said he was knocked over by a blast wave. Like Bruce Mendelsohn, John Mixon was allowed to run onto the scene and play hero. In the article here from the Portland Press-Herald, Mixon says that the blast wave knocked him right out of the bleachers. To which I reply, Fibber McGee, you're fired. There was no bomb. But we all saw something go boom, so let's briefly consider the question of how it's possible that what we saw wasn't a bomb. Is it possible that special effects experts could conduct a fairly convincing simulated explosion in a crowded area without injuring anyone? The answer is yes. They do it in the movies all the time, and also in military training battlefield simulations, as featured on this slide. And they also do it on stages at entertainment events. Of course, Hollywood pros can do much better, but here's an amateur small-scale demo of an explosion effect at close proximity. Now, if you try this at home, better to get someone you're not very fond of to stand there while you film from a safe distance, just in case. There is gunpowder involved in this, but the cloud is mostly dusty soil and fireplace ash. Notice that absolutely no part of his clothing was burned off. I should also mention that there are all kinds of explosion simulation effects which don't use gunpowder at all. There are pneumatic compressed air mechanisms, there are smoke machines, which come in a variety of shapes and sizes, and there are cryogenic CO2 jets. Often several different effects devices are used simultaneously in combination. Just add a well-timed flash of bright yellowish or orangish light to simulate a flaming core. The area within the railings would have been an ideal area for explosion simulation mechanisms, including smoke machines and cryogenic CO2 smoke jets. They could have possibly hidden pipes within the railings, or they could have possibly utilized the built-in metal pipes sticking out of the sidewalk in front of the building. Again, I'm only talking possibilities here, just to make the point that simulating a bomb explosion at the site would not have been beyond the ability of special effects professionals. It's worth noting that in the 6th and 7th and 8th Thorndike photos, we see a guy reaching under a board that appears to have a hole in it, and he picks something up from under the board. It looks like he's grabbing onto a handle. Could be a smoke machine. Could be a smoke machine disguised in a black bag. Just talking possibilities. And in Thorndike 9, 10, and 11, we see him walk towards the Marathon Sports Store with whatever he retrieved. The smoke could have been coming from several locations. In the photo at the top, from 2 seconds after the initial moment of the display, we see that a lot of the smoke is actually further back on the sidewalk towards the buildings. The photo on the bottom is from 5 seconds after, and we see that the flags that were not blowing outward from any wave of the so-called explosion at 2 seconds after are now blowing outwards furiously. It was a windy day, so who knows? But something else in this photo that we see is a stream of smoke apparently blowing sideways and downwards out of a window, as indicated by the blue arrow. Blowing smoke or fog out of the windows would have been easy enough to do. And that concludes our questioning of whether it would have been possible to simulate an explosion. It would have been a cakewalk for the professionals. Just a bit of industrial light and magic. Alright, now we're going to focus in depth on one of the most famous and iconic episodes of the Boston Marathon unbombing, and that is the heroic rescue of Jeff Bauman, who lost both of his legs, by Carlos Arredondo, who wears a cowboy hat and carries an American flag. It must have been some wheelchair ride. Jeff is looking pretty pale in the photo on the left, but appears to have regained his skin color in the photo on the right. Here's Carlos heroically jumping over the fencing to get to the scene. The Star-Spangled Banner is gallantly waving in his hand. And here's the award-winning photographer in the process of taking the iconic photograph we just saw. Okay, let's hear some interviews. Here's Carlos telling the Democracy Now! Program what happened.
I just concentrate and removing the fence to help everybody to come into the scene, and then I concentrate on a young man who lost both of the limbs. I rip up a t-shirt, and another gentleman helped me out, and we put these tourniquets in the legs, and then the first wheelchair they arrived, I pick him up and put in the wheelchair, and I drag him out of there because I still.
Okay. To summarize, Carlos says that he first removed some fencing and then concentrated on Jeff Bauman. He says that he ripped up a shirt and with another gentleman applied strips of the shirt as tourniquets to Jeff's legs, and then picked Jeff up and put Jeff in the first wheelchair that arrived and got Jeff out of there. Here Carlos gives the same story to CNN.
What did you see? What did you do?
Well, the first thing that I saw was a lot of injuries in the floor, people who lost limbs and broken legs, and immediately, we start clearing the area, the fence in particular, and then we start pretty much concentrating on one person at a time. Myself, I need in the ground to help this young man who lost both of his limbs, and I'm pretty much, we tied up, stop the bleeding as quick as we can and get him out of there as soon as we can, because this was the...
So to summarize, Carlos says that he jumped onto the scene, worked on removing fencing, and then went to Jeff. Carlos says that Jeff was bleeding when Carlos got to him, and that he applied tourniquets to stop the bleeding, and then put Jeff in a wheelchair and got Jeff out of there as quickly as possible. Here's Carlos on Boston's Dennis and Callahan show giving us more details on his interaction with Jeff.
So he was on his back and he hadn't seen what had happened to his lower legs, is that right, Carlos?
He was trying to move, but I avoid for him to see what happened to his legs.
Right.
Like that, a lot of blood was coming out of his limbs. So I reach a sweater in the ground and I rip it apart. And another Samaritan who came along to my side, he helped me out to stop the bleeding there.
So you put tourniquets, you and a fellow Samaritan put tourniquets on both of Jeff's legs.
And we put tourniquets there.
You held the artery in your hand, correct? We see the picture of you with the femoral artery.
Yeah, as soon as I pick him in the wheelchair, somebody came running with a wheelchair. I grabbed it right away because I know Jeff was needed to get out of there as soon as possible. So I put Jeff in the wheelchair, and then I just start holding his artery by turning around the piece of rope in my hand like that.
So to summarize, Carlos says that when he got to Jeff, he saw that Jeff was bleeding heavily from his legs. Carlos also repeats the story that he ripped up a shirt to use as tourniquets, which he applied with the help of another man to stop the bleeding. And then as soon as someone came running up with a wheelchair, Carlos grabbed it, right away, he says, and got Jeff out of there as soon as possible. The other Samaritan mentioned by Carlos to Dennis and Callahan is the man pictured here, Dr. Alan Panter. The official story is that together Carlos and Dr. Panter got tourniquets onto Jeff's legs. Panter has been quite vague in every interview about his interaction with Jeff, but let's listen.
And doctor, I know you encountered one man who had both lower limbs amputated?
Yes, he had lost both legs below the knee and then started working on a young lady.
Were you able to comfort him at all?
He was pretty much, as you would describe, in shock. He was mumbling words, but not coherently.
Teresa, you were about 0.2 miles from the finish line when the explosions took place. You were turned back, but you knew your husband...
So that's Dr. Panter. Here's a diagram from South Florida's Sun-Sentinel newspaper, which gives us a step-by-step, based on news and witness accounts, of the official story of Carlos and Dr. Panter. Please pause if you want to study it in depth. Jeff Bauman also gave an interview to Boston's Dennis and Callahan show, and Jeff's account is an abbreviated version of Carlos' account. Jeff was laying there on the ground thinking he's going to die, and then Carlos ran up and picked him up and threw him into a wheelchair.
Are you thinking at that point you're going to make it?
Not really. Actually, when Carlos picked me up and threw me into the wheelchair, then I was like, all right, maybe I am going to make it. But before that, no way. I thought I was done.
Carlos told us that two things he wanted to accomplish with you, Jeff, was to stop the bleeding as best he possibly could, which he did a pretty good job. And the other thing is he didn't want you necessarily to see exactly, what had happened to you. At what point did you see what had happened to you? Were you aware of what had happened?
Yeah.
So that's what Jeff has to say. Now we'll follow Carlos and Jeff through the extensive photographic and video footage. The evidence will reveal that the official story of Carlos and Jeff is in fact just a lie, and that Carlos and Jeff are but two members of a larger cast of crisis actor victims and pretend heroes and make-believe bystanders, all carrying out their given roles. Let's begin following Carlos with the first of many photos from the Ha Ha Tango set, showing his actions at the scene. Here Carlos is jumping over the fence. We also want to know where Jeff is on this stage. See where the blue line shows a brick-paved section of the sidewalk? Jeff is on the bricks in front of the black lamp post, as the next slide will reveal. The Thorndike set of photos shows us exactly where Jeff is. This photo is from the Thorndike sequence and captures 7 seconds after the pyrotechnic display. Jeff is circled. You can see his leg stumps up in the air. Looking from the street, he is in front of the black lamppost on the paved brick section, where the left edge of the bricks meets the cement sidewalk, as highlighted by the blue arrow. Now that we know where Jeff is, let's get back to following Carlos. We'll start with video footage showing Carlos jumping over the fence and proceed from there. So Carlos jumps over. We see him putting his cowboy hat on, flag in hand, from another angle. Here comes an EMT over the fence. To the left we see Dr. Panter is now over Jeff. From another angle. Okay. This is almost exactly 1 minute after the pyrotechnic display, and an EMT and Dr. Panter are standing directly over Jeff. So who needs Carlos to the rescue? In this photo, we see the EMT is turned around, and he's going to walk back a few feet and reach over the fence for his medical bag, as we shall see. Carlos at this moment, however, is crouched by the fence, preoccupied with his flag and his camera. In several interviews after the event, Carlos displayed his blood-soaked American flag and said that he dropped his flag on the blood-soaked ground after jumping over the fence, and that he also snapped 5 photos, oddly enough. Here's Carlos showing his photos later that day.
Look at this. Oh my God, you had excellent shots. My God, the horrible. Look at this.
Look at this.
What Carlos is covered with.
At the bottom of the slide is a portion of a Florida Sun-Sentinel article for which Carlos was extensively interviewed. He says he snapped 5 photos right after he jumped the fence because he thought it was important to record the moment. Okay then. Okay, now we're at 3 seconds after the last photo, 1 minute and 20 seconds after the pyrotechnic display. The paramedic retrieves his medical bag over the fence and goes back to Dr. Panter and Jeff. Carlos is still by the fence at 1 minute 28 seconds after. Carlos at 1 minute 30 seconds after. This is a still frame of video, keeping track of Carlos at 1 minute and 39 seconds after. Carlos at 1 minute 48 seconds after. Carlos at 1 minute 58 seconds after. 2 minutes after, Carlos still by the fence, rolling up his flag. At 2 minutes and 6 seconds after, Carlos is reaching for some scaffolding. Carlos moving scaffolding at 2 minutes and 10 seconds after. Remember that Dr. Panter and the EMT were already over Jeff at 1 minute after the pyrotechnic display. Now in this photo, at 2 minutes and 10 seconds after the pyrotechnic display, there are exactly 3 medical doctors and 1 EMT standing around Jeff. So who needs Carlos to the rescue? The official story about Carlos being Jeff's first responder and being the point man for Jeff's tourniquets is demonstrably false at this point. Let's keep following Carlos. There he is at the right at 2 minutes and 14 seconds after the pyrotechnic. Okay, we have some more video. We see Carlos still working on the fencing. Then we see this guy walk up, who I call a scene director, and he talks to Carlos, gives Carlos some instructions. Now a man in a yellow jacket hands Carlos a large flag. Here, you like flags, hold this. Dr. Panter steps out to talk to a cop, and the same man in the yellow jacket motions Panter back, with 4 waves of his hand, again in slow motion. Waving Panter back, not looking directly at Panter, discreetly telling Panter to get back into his place on the stage. Now the guy taps Carlos, takes the flag back from Carlos, and converses with Carlos. And there they are at 2 minutes and 39 seconds after the pyrotechnic display. No tourniquets yet for poor Jeff. Ha Ha Tango caught them standing there also. A few seconds later, and the next Ha Ha Tango photo, Carlos is standing alone by the pole. Maybe he's wondering where the wheelchair is for his big moment. Maybe Carlos is wondering why that empty wheelchair is being wheeled the wrong way, and why that other empty wheelchair is just sitting there. As already mentioned, according to a FEMA assessment, there was no lack of wheelchairs or stretchers near the scene. The report says, quote, volunteers and bystanders used over 100 wheelchairs and stretchers positioned around the finish line to transport victims to the medical tent, unquote. Here's a photo of a guy right near the finish line rolling a wheelchair at only 19 seconds after the pyrotechnic display. Unfortunately, he is going the wrong way. Maybe Carlos is wondering if anyone has thought to put tourniquets on Jeff's legs in all this time. I should mention that the use of tourniquets was highly commended all around in the days and weeks after the Boston unbombing. So let's consider Carlos' story that he and Dr. Panther quickly put tourniquets on Jeff before Carlos whisked Jeff off on the first available wheelchair. Here we see that Carlos has not gotten to Jeff yet, but we have already seen that Dr. Panther and an EMT were standing directly over Jeff at just over 1 minute after the pyrotechnic display. And we saw the paramedic retrieve his medical bag and bring it right back to Dr. Panther and Jeff. Here they are. Surely the Boston EMT knew that tourniquets would be essential for Jeff. Here's the basic treatment protocol for victims of explosions. Quote, limbs that are partially or completely amputated should be treated with the application of a tourniquet. It's just common sense. Then at almost 2.5 minutes after the pyrotechnic display, we saw 4 medical professionals, 3 doctors and an EMT, standing in a circle around Jeff. So has anyone put tourniquets on Jeff by now? The answer is no. Half a minute after the previous photo, the man on the left, circled and indicated by the blue arrow, comes onto the scene for the first time. He was not there before, but he is entering now, and he is easy to spot wearing a white visor. Note that he is also wearing camouflage pants and tan boots. Another half-minute passes, and we see that the man in the white visor and camouflage pants and tan boots is now standing very close to Jeff. Note that a woman is being taken out on a stretcher. Her name is Mary Daniel, and she was right next to Jeff on the bricks. You might not have noticed her next to Jeff in this video frame showing Jeff between Dr. Panther and the EMT. There she is. Mary Daniel is being taken away on a stretcher, so there will now be an empty spot where she was on the bricks. Here is where we find out if anyone has put tourniquets on Jeff yet. This photo, which we've already seen, was taken just after Mary Daniel was removed, and here we see that the guy with the camouflage pants and tan boots has arrived near Jeff. Here we clearly see that there is no tourniquet on Jeff's exposed left leg. His other leg is partially wrapped in Dr. Panther's jacket, but clearly his left leg has not received a tourniquet, which completely contradicts the official story and also contradicts common sense, given the number of medical professionals seen surrounding Jeff up to this moment. As already pointed out, one other thing we notice in this picture is a tube coming out of the back of Jeff's shorts. Well, well, well. Holy moly. Nobody at the scene cares about getting a tourniquet onto Jeff because everybody knows that Jeff is a crisis actor. Remember that Carlos said that when he reached Jeff he saw that a lot of blood was coming out of Jeff's legs. There is no way that a bunch of medical professionals wouldn't think to put tourniquets on Jeff's legs. It really is common sense. Just for perspective, consider this news report about a kayaker who had his foot bitten off by a shark. His friend put a makeshift tourniquet on his leg, and a nearby charter boat rushed him back to the dock, but he still bled to death before even reaching the dock. By the way, I forgot to mention who took this photo of the non-tourniqueted Jeff lying on the ground at 3 minutes after the pyrotechnic display. I'll give you one guess. Kill again? You guessed it. Cowboy Carlos took this photo. The image at the top left is from the video clip we saw of Carlos displaying his camera to an interviewer. Compare the photo of the camera to the photo at the bottom right. I labeled a few of the identical features. It's definitely the same photo. You may recall that Carlos told the Florida Sun-Sentinel that he quickly snapped 5 photos just after jumping over the fence. In reality, Carlos took this photo almost 2.5 minutes after he jumped the fence. And he released the photo to the public that very day, within mere hours after the unbombing, as the screenshots at the bottom show. Again, aside from the lack of tourniquets, the most revealing feature is the tube coming out of Jeff's clothes above his thigh. Okay. So back to this picture at 3 minutes and 10 seconds after the pyrotechnic display. In this photo, we see that Carlos has finally arrived near the non-tourniqueted Jeff, around the same time as the guy with the white visor and camo pants and tan boots. Now, if you think that Jeff will be getting out on a wheelchair anytime soon, then think again. As an overview of the whole scene at this point, we see that the area is fairly flooded with first responder medical professionals of all stripes. I should also note that by now several crisis actor victims have already been taken away by wheelchair or by stretcher. Some were wheelchaired out or walked out by way of the sidewalk, as indicated by the yellow arrow on the left, and some by way of the street, as indicated by the green arrow on the right. Let's keep following Carlos. The next we see of Carlos in the Ha Ha Tango set, he is fiddling with an ID on a lanyard. There's also a blue wheelchair in the background. There's been a number of wheelchairs going all around the area. The time here is 4 minutes and 5 seconds after the pyrotechnic display. We know the exact time in this photo from the man in the upper right, who is crossing past the tree and past the guy in the gray shirt with the medical volunteer's arm on his back. Boston Globe cameraman Steve Silva captured the guy about to pass the tree and the guy in the gray shirt with the volunteer's arm on his back at 4 minutes and 3 seconds after the pyrotechnic display. There he goes. Now this guy in the gray has been walking around the outskirts of the scene with no visible injuries except for a possible toothache, but he'll get a wheelchair ride out long before poor Jeff does. Moving on, next we see of Carlos, he is putting the ID lanyard on over his hat. The clock is actually being lowered for removal at this point, 4 minutes and 9 seconds after the pyrotechnic. Under the clock that is being lowered, the chief of Boston EMS, James Hooley, is entering the scene with a wheelchair in tow. He's probably pretty concerned about the fact that Jeff and so many others haven't been wheeled out of there yet. After all, it's only 1 block to the medical tent. The professional moulage artists are taking their time. They're not used to dealing with reality, but Hooley is, and it's starting to look bad from the medical responder side. On the right side of the picture, there is a medical volunteer girl in a red hat standing in front of the pole. She is holding onto a wheelchair, and you can see by the arm padding that the wheelchair is maroon. Here's a close-up of the last picture, showing the girl holding the maroon wheelchair. Just a few seconds later, from the other side of the scene, a photo shows the girl bringing in the maroon wheelchair. Carlos is still trying to get that dang ID necklace over his hat. Dr. Panther is right next to Jeff. You can see part of Jeff's left leg between the blue jeans of the guy in the orange shirt. Notice that there is no one at all between the maroon wheelchair and the spot where Dr. Panther and Jeff are. Now we see the girl with the maroon wheelchair is right behind Carlos and Dr. Panther. There is no one between them and the maroon wheelchair. Are they going to finally put Jeff into a wheelchair? This is the next picture of the Ha Ha Tango sequence, 4 minutes and 20 seconds after the pyrotechnic display. In the bottom right of this picture, we see that Carlos is now standing directly in front of the maroon wheelchair, actually leaning into the wheelchair, which couldn't be any closer to him. Jeff Bauman is on the ground next to him. Is Carlos going to put Jeff into the first wheelchair he could get his hands on, like he said? No. The crew decides to put the wheelchair back onto the street. We have video footage. The blue arrow points to the girl and the maroon wheelchair. And she puts the wheelchair back. Incredible. Now, if we look to the front of the tree that is to the right of the wheelchair, we see that at least our toothache victim in the gray shirt gets a wheelchair ride out. In the next Ha Ha Tango photo, we see the maroon wheelchair is back on the street. Toothache Timmy is getting a wheelchair ride out, and there is a little huddle going on around Jeff. It's now 4 minutes and 43 seconds after the pyrotechnic display. My guess is that they are having trouble with Jeff's moulage. No one wants a fake leg bone falling off on the iconic wheelchair ride with Cowboy Carlos. The lowered clock is now being removed, because no one wants to see a clock on the iconic wheelchair ride showing how much time has actually passed, when the script is that Carlos threw Jeff into the first wheelchair that came along and whisked him off to the nearby medical tent, just 1 block away. Next we see of Carlos, it's almost 5.5 minutes after the pyrotechnic display, and he is holding something up in the air. Precious time is passing. A girl pushing a blue wheelchair has been circling the area for over a minute. The next Ha Ha Tango photo unfortunately doesn't capture the whole scene, but we see at the right that the girl with the blue wheelchair has finally moved close to Carlos and Jeff. The next Ha Ha Tango photo we see of Carlos, he is taking Jeff on that iconic wheelchair ride. Now, how long did it take him to get Jeff into that blue wheelchair and whisk him across the finish line? On the day of the event, a brief bit of footage was aired which, when magnified and stabilized, shows the marathon clock that had been set to the side on the ground. And there you have it. The marathon clock says 4:16:16. They crossed the finish line at 6 minutes and 33 seconds after the pyrotechnic display. But every last article in the mainstream media forwarded the lie that Carlos immediately rescued Jeff. Here's a typical report from GQ. Mind you, the pyrotechnic display was at 2:49 p.m. Here is GQ's account of Carlos' rescuing of Jeff, happening at 2:50 p.m., 1 short minute later. Quote, 2:50. A man in a cowboy hat is leaning over Bauman, etc., etc., etc. And still at 2:50, quote, a woman appears with a wheelchair. He's got to go, the man in the hat tells the woman. He turns to Bauman. I'm going to pick you up now. End quote. The important point is that the mainstream media got their story from the first-hand accounts of the people directly involved. For example, here is one of the many medical professionals who participated in the hoax that is the Boston unbombing. In this first-person account of his experience in the medical tent, this male nurse forwards the official story of the speedy rescue of Jeff by Cowboy Carlos. The nurse writes, quote, the first victim to come into the tent was an image I would never forget. A young man was wheeled in with both of his legs amputated by the blast, unquote. By which of course he means Jeff Bauman, who was the only double amputee there. But it is really unfathomable to think that this nurse could have missed 11 people who were brought into the medical tent before Jeff Bauman was brought in. A few of them were sporting some pretty serious fake blood, and according to the official script, several of them were very, very seriously injured. A simple examination of the video footage from several news sources, particularly the Boston Globe and ABC News, shows us conclusively that at least 11 people, beginning with a cop in a wheelchair, were all brought into the medical tent before Jeff Bauman. Here are the 11 people. According to the official story, some of them were very close to death when brought into the tent, by which we know that the medical tent nurse who claimed that Jeff was in first is lying. I should actually say that at least 11 people were brought in before Jeff, because there may have been a few more that the news cameras didn't catch. Here's another nurse, named Betty Sparks, who tells the same lie. Quoting from her interview with the Improper Bostonian, she says, quote, I texted Scott to ask where the explosions were. Before he replied, a police officer was wheeled in with a bandage around his head. The next announcement called for ER nurses and doctors to grab supplies and go to the finish line. I did just that. As I ran out, Jeff Bauman was being wheeled towards me. Both of his legs were gone. Unquote. Let's hear her tell the same story in a different interview with CTV.
So that when we heard the bombs go off, I wasn't totally sure what it was. But they asked for nurses and doctors to go out to the finish line with IV equipment, which I did. And the first sight I saw was Jeff coming across, and he had already lost 90% of his legs. Mm-hmm. And at that point in time, I have to say I was very frightened for what I was going to see when I got out there.
Okay. Now, we know she's not telling the truth because she makes it clear that she ran out of the tent very soon and passed Jeff's wheelchair. As we know, in reality, Jeff's wheelchair was not being wheeled to the medical tent until almost 7 minutes after the pyrotechnic display, in which time Nurse Betty could not have possibly missed 10 of the people brought into the medical tent before Jeff, including a few who are said to have almost died, and one who had to have a leg amputated. Now back to the article. Nurse Betty adds another lie. So picking up from where we were, quote, "As I ran out, Jeff was being wheeled towards me. Both of his legs were gone. Next I saw a stretcher coming at me. They were performing CPR on Crystal Campbell," unquote. As you recall, Crystal is the girl that they say died. We know Nurse Betty is lying because the fact is that they didn't wheel Crystal Campbell across the finish line until almost 3 minutes after they wheeled Jeff out. Crystal's stretcher hadn't even arrived yet empty to the pyrotechnic display site when they were wheeling Jeff out. Crystal wasn't wheeled out until a whopping 9.5 minutes after the pyrotechnic display. There was absolutely positively nobody in any stretcher on the road during the whole time that Jeff was being wheeled up to the medical tent. In fact, before Jeff's wheelchair ride, there was only 2 stretchers brought up the road to the medical tent. One was carrying Victoria McGrath, and the other was carrying Mary Daniel, and they were wheeled away from the finish line almost side by side, starting at 3.5 minutes after the pyrotechnic display, and arrived at the medical tent long before Jeff was even in a wheelchair. The next stretcher carrying anybody up the road crossed the finish line over 2 minutes after Jeff was already in the medical tent, and that stretcher was carrying Crystal Campbell. Again, Crystal wasn't wheeled out until 9.5 minutes after the pyrotechnic display. This slide is a still frame from Boston Globe cameraman Steve Silva's footage, showing Crystal's stretcher a block past the finish line on the way to the medical tent at 10 minutes and 21 seconds after the pyrotechnic display. In the upper right is a photo of them taken from above the finish line for comparison. That's definitely them. Also, the time-lapse finish line camera ends at 9 minutes and 20 seconds after the pyrotechnic display, and Crystal's stretcher has not crossed the finish line before the time-lapse video ends. So we know for certain that they didn't get Crystal out until over 9.5 minutes after. Not only is Nurse Betty Sparky full of malarkey, but Crystal Campbell did not die at the Boston unbombing. Perhaps she is enjoying a new career overseas. Perhaps she's had a little light cosmetic surgery. Or perhaps she was dead before the unbombing, and they used her identity as a casualty. Perhaps Crystal isn't even her real name. One thing's for sure, though. She didn't die at the Boston unbombing. All right. In yet another interview, Nurse Betty tells the same lie about passing both Jeff's wheelchair and Crystal's stretcher as she was running right out. Plus she adds another lie, saying that she treated a woman named Lou, meaning the Asian woman Lu Ling-zi, who was the only reported female victim named Lou that day. But the problem for Nurse Betty is that Lu Ling-zi was at the second site, and Nurse Betty did not go to the second site. Nurse Betty herself said that she went to the first site, near the finish line. Let's listen.
I'm like, no, it's a transformer. And then the second one off. And at that time, to my left, I saw the Boston EMS gentleman start setting up IVs, setting up cots. So at that point in time, we knew something was wrong.
And what was your thought as you're running to the finish line, knowing that your son and your daughter-in-law may be involved in this?
I was very frightened, especially as I'm running. Who's coming toward me is Jeff, the individual who's in the wheelchair that was losing both legs.
Yes.
And another stretcher had Crystal in it that they were doing active CPR. So I'm running past that site, and I get to where all the casualties were now on the ground with blood everywhere. So now I'm feeling a little panicky. I can feel the tears now starting to come to my eyes. I remember getting to the site. They were doing CPR on the young girl, Lou. And I looked down, and they say, I need a defibrillator. So I stood up and I yelled for an AED, and one of the Boston EMS threw it to me, and I handed it down, opened it up, and turned it on.
Okay. Again, the problem for Nurse Betty is that Lu Lingzi was at the second site, and Nurse Betty did not go to the second site. Nurse Betty herself said she went to the first site near the finish line. In the article featured in the previous slide, Nurse Betty talks about running into the Marathon sports store at the first site. At the upper left of this slide is a photo from Ha Ha Tango catching Nurse Betty at the first site. In the article from the previous slide, she talks about running into the Marathon sports store at the first site. At the upper left of this slide is a photo from Ha Ha Tango catching Nurse Betty at the first site at around 8 minutes after the display. At the lower left, another photographer catches her a little over 9 minutes after. The picture at the lower middle is Nurse Betty helping to wheel out crisis actress Michelle LaRue from the first site near the finish line. The photo at the lower right is a still frame of Nurse Betty helping to run Michelle up Boylston Street to the medical tent. Okay, I don't want to be unfair to Nurse Betty. All nurses are actually heroes in many ways, and I know Nurse Betty really has done many selfless and courageous things. For instance, she volunteered to go to Haiti and treat the desperate people there in the aftermath of the terrible earthquake several years ago. I don't want to unfairly pick on Nurse Betty. There must be a reason why she consented to participate in the Boston on-bombing hoax. Can you guess what might have enticed Nurse Betty to participate in this hoax and to lie? Is it because she's a Satanist and a 34th degree Illuminati? Not exactly. Perhaps she was just philosophically vulnerable to statist con artists. Perhaps she was sold the idea that the ends justify the means, and that emergency preparedness programs were under threat and she would be helping to save them by participating. But unfortunately for her and for all other like-minded participants in this hoax, and for us, the globalist war profiteers and regime changers had their own plans for how to utilize this hoax, which we will discuss in depth a bit later in this presentation. But we're not done yet with Jeff and Carlos. Now that we know how much time has actually passed before Carlos ran off with Jeff in a wheelchair, we should see that this gross photograph plainly illustrates a hoax in action. Because while some might excuse the idea of Carlos throwing Jeff into a wheelchair like this soon after the blast, there is absolutely no excuse after more than 6 minutes of doctors and paramedic equipment bags literally surrounding Jeff, for Jeff to be sent off in a wheelchair like this, with loose flaps of flesh dangling every which way and even down to a front wheel of the wheelchair, and with his legs not securely wrapped in sterile bandages, according to the most basic emergency care protocols. This would never be allowed. In fact, sending Jeff out on a wheelchair at all instead of a stretcher would never be allowed. To the left of Carlos there is a professional EMT accompanying them from behind, and there is a physician approaching them from in front, and they are actually allowing this? It is ridiculous. I know this is ugly as hell, but it's all moulage, and we have to look. This is a magnification of the previous photo with exposure lightened for better clarity. Look at the huge flap of torn fake flesh hanging down in the middle, from his left leg all the way down to the front wheel. There is some kind of gristle or ligament in imminent danger of being run over by or entangled in the wheel. There are also loose ligaments and vessels and flaps of flesh flapping out from the other side of his left leg. His unwrapped right leg appears to be actually tearing at the thigh. Again, it's all moulage, calculated for the right effect from a Hollywood perspective, but it's absolutely ridiculous from a medical responder perspective. It's time to go over the basics of emergency response. There are 3 basic guidelines for traumatic amputation. 1. Stop the bleeding. 2. Elevate the injured area. And 3. Wrap the injured area. It's common sense to wrap and bandage any wound, including traumatic amputations. Again, the same basic guidelines. Control the bleeding, elevate, and wrap the stump. EMSworld.com tells us that with traumatic amputations, the purpose of wrapping the stump is to reduce additional contamination or injury. The protocol of elevating the amputated limb is one of several common-sense reasons why professional EMTs normally take traumatic leg amputation victims away on stretchers and not wheelchairs. In fact, stretchers and not wheelchairs are a basic protocol for any severely injured persons. At the left is a page from an EMS primer about moving victims to safety. It says, quote, "Use standard stretchers when available." As mentioned, they were not low on stretchers near the finish line that day, according to reports. Here's another first-hand account of the pyrotechnic display aftermath from a doctor named Shushrut Jangi Pants on Fire. He says, quote, "Through the haze, the stretchers arrived." Maybe it was so hazy that he mistook wheelchairs for stretchers. Now I want to backtrack to Carlos' claim that he was holding on to Jeff's artery while running alongside during the wheelchair ride. This claim is so absurd and so contrary to normal medical protocol that it was discounted by many people who assumed that Carlos was holding part of a tourniquet, despite what Carlos himself said to radio hosts Dennis and Callahan. See the Wikipedia section from below about this. The artery story was just a misunderstanding, Wikipedia says. The entire story of Carlos and Jeff is just a merry-go-round of lies. One lie leads to another. You may be getting tired of these guys, but fear not, we're almost done with them. Just a few more lies to expose. Returning to this picture, we see that there is some serious moulage attached to Jeff's legs. The way this is done in trauma simulation is to attach a moulage prosthetic on top of the existing leg stumps, and this is the case with Jeff. So let's look for any evidence of the crew setting up Jeff's moulage prosthetics. We can assume they would have wanted to get the main work done very soon after the pyrotechnic display, while the scene was still clouded in smoke, which would provide cover in which to work without being seen. Well, well, well. Looks like we have some persons of interest in this close-up from the fourth Thorndike photo at 4 seconds after the pyrotechnic display. Our persons of interest are even clearer in this close-up from the sixth Thorndike photo. From here I'm going to backtrack again through Thorndike 5, 4, 3, and 2, so that you will be able to spot them in the heavier smoke of the earlier pictures. Thorndike 5. Back to Thorndike 4. Christian Williams is the man in the hood with his hand on Jeff Bauman's right leg. Mary Daniels is between the two men, and she is grasping Jeff's hand. How soon after the pyrotechnic display is this? Let's zoom out. The marathon clock isn't in the photo, but see, circled at the top, the runner in the orange shirt with both sneakers on the H of the finish line? There he is at marathon time 4:09:48, 4 seconds after the initial moment of the first pyrotechnic display. Now Thorndike 3. Let's zoom out. The runner in the green shirt at the top is approaching the finish line, and the guy in the orange shirt has not arrived there yet. He is mostly obscured by a flag in this photo. And there they are, 3 seconds after the pyrotechnic display. Now Thorndike 2, 2 seconds after the pyrotechnic display. It's very hazy, but you can see Christian Williams is already in position with his hand on Jeff's leg. They were in position immediately. Now let's go forward through the photos. Thorndike 3. Christian is in position. His hand is on Jeff's leg. Thorndike 4. Christian's hand is on Jeff's leg. Mary's hand is on Jeff's hand. Thorndike 5. Christian's hand is on Jeff's leg, and Mary is gripping Jeff's hand. It's 4 seconds after the pyrotechnic display. Before we go through the next pictures, I want to make 3 points. Firstly, in trauma simulation kits, as well as in Hollywood effects design, silicone amputation prosthetics often incorporate tubes and ports for the simulation of bleeding. Secondly, most leg prosthetics, whether special effects moulage pieces or normal day-to-day prosthetics for amputees, stay attached by the mechanism of suction or vacuum, and in the process of attachment an expulsion valve and a tube are used to expel all the air between the skin and the prosthetic, and thereby create the suction that keeps the prosthetic in place. Thirdly, a well-known trick in the world of Hollywood special effects is to make silicone body parts that are rigged to burst open, full of moulage and fake blood, when triggered to do so by various mechanisms. Now, that said, in the following images you will see Christian and Mary working intently on Jeff's legs. My interpretation of the images is that they are securing the prosthetic by air expulsion and suction, and that they are also activating the pump rig incorporated into the prosthetic. And thirdly, they are opening the prosthetic, which is sealed but rigged to burst open with increasing pressure from the incorporated pump rig. As we look through these photos, what is very definite and without a doubt is that this is not the chaotic aftermath of a bomb. According to the official story, Christian Williams and Mary Daniels both received extremely severe injuries, both nearly dying, and they certainly wouldn't be set up like this over Jeff, decisively manipulating his leg throughout this sequence of photos. Not to mention that Christian is wearing sunglasses, as you will see, and he wouldn't have even been able to see or know what he was doing so intently in the heavy smoke unless he was going through pre-planned steps. Thorndike 6. Christian reaches up. Mary is holding Jeff's hand. Thorndike 7. Christian is pulling a strap off over his hood. Mary is gripping Jeff's open hand. Her orange bag is laid over Jeff's waist. Thorndike 8. Christian moves the strap down. Mary is grasping Jeff's hand, and Jeff has grasped the strap. Thorndike 9. Christian moves the strap over Jeff's leg. Jeff and Mary close their hand grasp even more, and Jeff is holding the strap. Thorndike 10. Jeff pulls down on the strap. Mary's hand is still on Jeff's hand. The prosthetic on Jeff's right leg oddly changes color, and something has popped out of the left side of the prosthetic at the knee. In this photo we find out that Christian has been doing his work here in the thick smoke while wearing sunglasses. Thorndike 11. Mary's right hand is still on Jeff's hand. She extends her left arm and appears to be giving a hand signal. Whatever has popped out on the left side of Jeff's knee is still there. Thorndike 12. The strap is now off Jeff's leg. Mary is still giving a signal with her left hand and still grasping Jeff's hand with her right hand. Thorndike 13. Mary's left hand is still signaling, her right hand is still grasping Jeff's hand. Whatever has popped out of the left side of Jeff's knee is still there. This photo is 8 seconds after the pyrotechnic display. If this were actually real, and the official story true, then these 3 people should be in a pool of blood by now. The bricks that they are on are red-colored, but we would clearly see a deep red pool of blood all around them, and especially on the right by the legs of Christian and Mary, if the official story were true. The official story is that Christian Williams had very severe injuries to both legs which required multiple surgeries, and that he nearly lost his right leg, and also that his right hand was severely injured. The official story of Mary Daniel is that she had very severe injuries to both legs, resulting in the medical amputation of her left leg. Obviously, Jeff Bauman has leg issues of his own. They are not in a huge puddle of blood, however, and we see no blood on the ground around their non-bleeding legs, because this is fake. I should note, however, that it is a medical possibility that if this were real, then Christian and Mary could be bleeding significantly more than Jeff, because sometimes in complete traumatic amputations the blood vessels may constrict, which may reduce the bleeding. Or on the other hand, sometimes a complete traumatic amputation may result in quickly bleeding to death. It depends on different factors. In any case, reduced bleeding does not mean zero bleeding, as appears to be the case here. Also, remember that we heard Carlos say that he saw a lot of blood coming out of Jeff's legs. And note that here Mary is wearing a red jacket and a white blouse, and her immaculately white blouse testifies to the actual lack of blood from Jeff's legs up to this point. Thorndike 14. Again, Mary's left hand is still signaling, her right hand is still grasping Jeff's hand. Whatever has popped out of the left side of Jeff's knee is still there. Thorndike 15. Mary is still signaling, they're still holding hands, Christian is moving back from them. Thorndike 16. Mary's left hand is still signaling, her right hand is still grasping Jeff's hand. She's looking at Jeff intently. Thorndike 17. Still looking and signaling and holding hands. Thorndike 18. Now we see what looks like blood or moulage coming out of Jeff's right leg, as the color of his thigh changes again. The prosthetic setup is doing what it was rigged to do. Thorndike 19. The prosthetic fake blood and moulage rig on Jeff's leg has finally opened up. Christian moves back more. Mary still signals with her left hand. Her right hand has released Jeff's hand. Thorndike 20. Mary is still positioned over Jeff. Thorndike 21. A blurry picture, but Mary appears to be grasping Jeff's right leg. Thorndike 22. Mary's hand is on or near Jeff's right leg. Christian may be holding a fake blood squib in his right hand. Thorndike 23. Mary is still over Jeff. Her hand is on or near Jeff's right leg. Thorndike 24. Mary is still over Jeff. Thorndike 25. Mary's hand moves in tandem with Jeff's leg. Christian and Mary have been working intently on Jeff over this entire sequence of photos. These are definitely not severely injured people in a state of chaos and shock. Just for the sake of thoroughness, I'll present some mainstream media accounts of the official stories of Mary's and Christian's injuries. For starters, the official story is that both Mary and Christian were severely injured and both almost died. Here are Christian's own photos and descriptions, which were linked to his GoFundMe page. Let's take a look. He almost lost a leg. He had multiple wounds to both legs, which required multiple tourniquets to stop the bleeding. He could actually see his femur bone in one wound, and his right hand was severely injured. Here's Christian and the doctor who, according to the official story, initially treated him at Beth Israel Medical Center. She said Christian's injuries were extensive to both legs and, quote, his hand had been basically blown off and his index finger was hanging by a thread. Here Christian is shown in 2 frames of news coverage being wheelchaired away from the first pyrotechnic display site. They just weren't in the mood for stretchers that day. How does that right hand look? Let's magnify the photo on the right. At the top left is the magnified photo of his right hand from the last slide. Now compare that to the photo on the bottom left of his right hand from his GoFundMe page. In the wheelchair photo, his hand is bloodless, with no sign of any damage on the clearly visible side of his middle finger, unlike the same side of the same finger from his GoFundMe photo, which is made to look horribly flayed and charred. The photo on the right side of this slide is Williams lying on the ground less than a minute after the pyrotechnic display. His right hand is bloodless and shows no sign of any damage, and still wearing those shades. Here's a compilation of the official story of Mary Daniel. They had to amputate her left leg. She lost a massive chunk of her right leg. She was rushed unconscious to the hospital, and her heart stopped twice during surgery, after which she was in a coma for a few days. Mary eventually ended up with 14 other amputee crisis actors from the Boston unbombing as the very first inpatients at the brand new, just opening $225 million Spaulding Rehabilitation Center near Boston. It was great PR for the Spaulding Center, and also a great way to sequester the crisis actors safely away from unwanted eyes at a variety of other medical facilities, as the make-believe rehabilitation and physical therapy phase of the hoax commenced. Okay, now I'd like to talk about the elements of staging and the actions of the stage crew at the Boston unbombing show. I would say that the evidence of fake moulage wounds and impossibly non-bleeding wounds and impossibly unwounded skin under allegedly shrapnel-shredded clothing are what we could call direct evidence. And as such things are evidence of a fake staged event on the whole, it logically follows that there would be evidence of a crew being involved in staging such an event, which is what we could call essential circumstantial evidence. Given the large amounts of photographic and video footage, it should be obvious enough to spot this when we look for it. We shouldn't assume that the crew would have any superhuman ability to hide what they are up to, but rather that they would be naturally incapable of hiding what they are doing from anyone paying very close attention and having an ample amount of data to scrutinize. We have much more than an ample amount of data, and we are paying very close attention. I think it would be good to preface our stage crew investigation by mentioning a brave film producer named Nathan Folks, who is the man standing in the middle of this picture wearing a tie. While Folks was watching the news reports on the day of the Boston unbombing, he noticed a number of glaring discrepancies which were to him, having an insider's perspective of a film industry professional, telltale signs of a staged event. You might notice Cowboy Carlos standing on the left in this picture. Carlos was featured in a 2012 documentary movie produced by Folks called The Prosecution of an American President. Of course, Folks was surprised to see Carlos featured in the Boston unbombing. After watching the news coverage of the unbombing and after several subsequent phone conversations with Carlos' wife Melita, Folks became certain that Carlos had been recruited, or one might say exploited, by the creators of this event. In various interviews about the Boston unbombing, Folks has mentioned spotting common elements of hyper-realistic filmmaking and also spotting people performing the tasks of scene directors and crew coordinators and makeup artists and stagehands, which is not to say that these were professional movie industry people, but to say that these were people performing these roles, as is done in hyper-realistic emergency response drills. Folks has also pointed out that most of the live mainstream news coverage of the Boston unbombing was not done with the HD technology which was commonplace by 2013, but rather used an older low-definition technology from circa 2002 and earlier, which is grainier and blurrier and therefore much safer for the perpetrators of a mass deception. Let's hear a snippet of Folks talking with talk show host Richie Allen.
It wasn't until the Boston bombing, marathon bombing for me, did I really see the truth, because of the people I knew that were involved and things that I could actually prove myself and sit there and show, look, this person used to work with me on this production. I know exactly how they did this. I mean, it took all of that to finally make me aware. Having hard evidence and proof because of my experience, that then I could actually come out and say what really happened.
Which I've said a few times, it must have been an extraordinarily difficult decision for you to make with your background and with your career.
Good on you, Nathan. Before continuing, I just want to doubly clarify that the use of words like scene directors and scene coordinators and stagehands isn't meant to imply that there were movie industry people brought in to carry out these roles at the unbombing. Generally, the people filling out these roles in large emergency response drills come from a variety of federal and state and local agencies and departments related to the arena of emergency response, and such was the case with the unbombing, by and large. In the official Department of Homeland Security guidelines for large emergency response drills, These roles are described by words like controllers, evaluators, players, actors, facilitators, and simulators. We see some of these roles described in the article featured in this slide, which is a page from the Controller and Evaluator Handbook for a large medical disaster drill in Alameda County, California, which followed the guidelines of the Department of Homeland Security Exercise and Evaluation Program. And here's the cover of a guidelines manual from the Homeland Security and Evaluation Program, which spells sheep. I mean HASEEP. In these guidelines we read about the various roles. The head directors or managers of a large emergency drill or exercise are called exercise controllers. Their job is to keep things running according to the master plan, and they get a handbook to help them. And here's some more details from these Department of Homeland Security guidelines. At the top we see a description of the victim actors, aka crisis actor victims. We also see a description of moulage, which includes fake blood and fake bones as well as fake wounds. I should mention that prefabricated silicone moulage wounds don't require a long setup time. There were a few of those at the unbombing, but mostly there was just fake blood spattered about and some clothing sheared as if by scissors or a razor. We also see a description of special effects, including pyrotechnics and controlled explosives. So, you get the point. Alright. Let's begin our own investigation of the stage crew and their various tasks and duties in attempting to pull off this hoax. We'll start by playing a clip we saw earlier of the scene director giving Carlos some instructions. Again, we see the man in the yellow jacket handing Carlos a large flag. There he is. As we saw before, Dr. Panther steps out to talk to a cop and the man in the yellow jacket bumps him back. Played again, slow motion. The man in the yellow jacket bumps him back with 4 waves of his hand, discreetly, but not at all discreetly enough. This is a huge discrepancy. And talking to Carlos. There's something else that you may have missed in that last video clip. Keep your eye on the middle where the star is. You'll see the woman in the yellow shirt point at the camera that is filming to alert the crew to a breach, and then several people will step in the way to block the camera's view. They didn't even want mainstream media cameras too close to the scene or capturing too much of the action. There's your point. And there you have it. And there are other instances of camera pointing and blocking. Keep your eye where the blue arrow is pointing to the guy in the white shirt. A woman will walk up and he will point to the camera that is filming, and they will both look at the camera and then step out to block the camera's view. Here we go. There's the point. I'll play that again, slow motion. Oh, shit. Now he steps out to block, picks his crotch, disgusting slob. And that's it for that clip. Now here's a video showing several camera blockers and scene coordinators in action. The fat woman in the brown shirt is a crisis actor who mainly works as a scene blocker. You'll see that she walks to the right into a storefront and a scene coordinator chases her and literally pushes her back out onto the scene. There she goes into the storefront, and here comes the scene coordinator chasing her in and pushing her back out onto the scene. Okay. I'm going to play it again to show some more blockers that hang around throughout the event. This red-headed woman in the blue shirt, we'll call her Ginger, is a blocker. We have a few more here. We have Beckham in the crazy outfit here, and Bird in the light green shirt. The crew is ever vigilant to shield the scene from unwanted eyewitnesses and unwanted cameras. Now here is the person who took that video footage we just watched being shouted off the scene. This photo from Ha Ha Tango shows us a minute later, after the person who was taking that last video was shouted away. Our scene blockers, who I circled and pointed to with red arrows, are still on the scene. They stay on the scene throughout the event. No one ever tells them to leave. There's also a new unwanted camera, the woman in the orange headscarf, and she will be shouted out. The other two people holding cameras, the guy in the white sweatshirt in front of her and the guy in the blue and black jacket to the right, will not be shouted away because they are part of the crew. The video clip we're about to see begins within a second or two of that previous Ha Ha Tango photo. I circled the window from where Ha Ha Tango is taking pictures. Now we'll see the crew attempting to block the scene and then shouting away the unwanted camera holder who is taking this video. The guy in the white shirt just asked Ginger, "Get them out." Play it again. He says, "You don't want to be here, leave." The camera holder in the blue and black is conversing with the scene blockers. Go. Kicking them out.
We gotta find Joanna. Come on!
The scene of photo op, leave. Okay. The seeming bystanders who are actually crew members never leave the scene. There's really too many of them to point out in any one photo, but here's Beckham, and tracking him through the event is like playing Where's Waldo? Where's Beckham? Psst, it's all fake. Okay, here's some more crew members who play the role of bystanders. The guy in the light gray sweatshirt and the guy in the green jacket and dark baseball cap arrive several minutes in and start playing their parts. I call them Frickin' Frack. They are scripted as bystanders and also as heroic helpers. The guy at the left in a red shirt wearing glasses is a scene coordinator or scene director, and he has a managing role over the entire stage. Next we see Frickin' Frack have moved into the middle of the scene while the director is giving orders. Here he is giving a stay out signal to somebody. The next we see Frickin' Frack have been moved to the side while the scene coordinator in the red shirt walks down to check the perimeter. The next we see of Frickin' Frack, they are kneeling over a crisis actress victim, quite oddly enough, considering that there is a Boston EMS paramedic standing right there, ignoring her. Not to mention the many other doctors and other medical staff on the scene at this point. We also see that the scene coordinator in the red shirt is speaking with a cop. Here's a view from the other side of the stage showing Frickin' Frack over the same crisis actress. Again, the Boston EMS paramedic is standing aside, because Frickin' Frack got this covered. The bottom right photo shows this crisis actress positioned on the stage, and at the bottom left is one of the more well-known photos of this event, showing this same crisis actress sitting up on the sidewalk soon after the pyrotechnic display. Several minutes later, Frick is in the upper left corner coming out of his storefront. He's been going all over the place. I'm just giving the highlights here. The director in the red shirt is in the lower right corner. Beckham is in the upper middle doing what he does best. The scene coordinator in the red shirt spends most of his time going from crisis actor victim to crisis actor victim, checking over the whole stage. Here he is over one victim, and here he is over another victim, butting in front of a Boston EMS paramedic. Maybe you can spot Beckham and Frickin' Frack in the crowd. There were actually many regular people, meaning non-medical and non-police, who just walked onto the scene well after the pyrotechnic display. There were all kinds of people who were allowed onto the scene, but that all kinds of people was actually limited to people who were crew members and insiders to the event. Anyone else was excluded. For instance, Catholic priests who ran out of the church halfway up the block were absolutely barred from the scene, as this Wall Street Journal article notes. Please pause and read if you like. Priests were absolutely denied entry, but Cowboy Carlos was allowed to run in, and then he was given full access and specific directions, and then he was used as a political tool by globalist thugs. Here's Carlos and Jeff at the 2014 State of the Union address, surrounded by a bunch of miserable-looking people, listening to President Obama promise to keep bombing Syria for our protection. Okay. Now I'm going to replay the same clip I played twice before to point out two more senior crew members. Keep your eye to the left of Carlos. And there they are. And there they are. Here they are from a different angle, a few seconds after the last photo. What was the man in the blue hat directing with his hand? Apparently it was the positioning of these two gals on the ground here. The man in the blue hat, who I call Director 1, may be the senior exercise controller, to use the correct lingo. The man dressed in black is a prominent Boston real estate developer named Bob Epstein. I call him Bob the Builder. And he seems to have some position of authority on the stage, though not on the same level as Director 1. And pay no attention to that ridiculous hollow leg farther back in the middle. Let's just track these two fellows from a bit earlier than that last scene to a bit later. Here Director 1 is on the left, clearly instructing two police officers. Bob the Builder is by the fence at work on a crisis actor victim. Now Director 1 is instructing a Boston EMS paramedic, and Bob the Builder is talking with a cop. Back to where we saw Director 1 instructing Carlos. Back to Director 1 instructing the paramedic positioning the crisis actors lying on the ground. Now we've seen Director 1 instructing both cops and medical staff, but he is neither cop nor medical. He is something else. As a rule, police don't instruct medical professionals on doing their jobs, and vice versa, but senior exercise controllers instruct everyone. Moving forward, a little later Bob the Builder is talking with the paramedic, and Director 1 is bent over a crisis actor victim. In all, there are about 7 or more directors or scene coordinators at the site, as far as I can tell. As mentioned, the guy in red is some kind of scene coordinator, and there is a whole story to the stay-out hand gesture he is giving here, which we will soon investigate. But I also want to mention this woman in the pink vest, who we'll call Pink Vest Lady. Pink Vest Lady was standing very close to Ground Zero at the moment of the first pyrotechnic display, but was apparently unscathed. From immediately after the pyrotechnic through several minutes after, she is seen moving from crisis actor to crisis actor, bending over them and reaching in and out of her black bag all the while. Our friend Nathan Folks identified her as performing the task of a makeup artist. She's not a professional makeup artist by any means, but she is helping to spread the fake blood around a bit. She's actually Bob the Builder's wife, and her name is Esta. Several of their friends and family members are on the stage. Now, Esta in the pink vesta may have had a couple of makeup items in her little black bag, which might have something to do with why she had black gloves on immediately after the pyrotechnic display and then took them off later. It's generally unclear what she keeps reaching in her bag for, but in some photos we see her holding a small bottle of clear liquid, which raises the possibility that one effect in use that day was so-called magic blood powder. As the ad at the top reads, the powder is invisible, but when sprayed or splashed with water or clear liquid glycerin, turns dark red. It's great for instant wound effects and realistic splashing blood, and great, as the ad reads, for the effect of a blast victim. Now, I'm not just pulling this magic blood powder speculation out of my butt. Magic blood powder is actually an element of disaster simulation exercises, as this article relates. Quote, drill participants can apply the magic blood powder to themselves before an exercise. Then when the time comes for them to portray victims, they can activate the powder with water. Unquote. You can also put it on the ground or wherever else you want blood to magically appear. The old just add water to the invisible blood powder trick is one possible explanation for this anomalous clear tube, which was laid across the floor of the Sugary Heaven store and out the door and along the ground over to where some fake blood-splattered crisis actors were positioned. The blue arrows point to the clear tube in each picture. Another scene worth pointing out in regards to magic blood powder is this instance of Pink Vest Lady directly dabbing a crisis actor victim. Perhaps she was dabbing with and spreading around magic blood powder, as well as the clear liquid that activates it. Here is a clip from Colton Kilgore's center stage video. We see that our friend Running Boy has returned to center stage a few minutes after he ran away, and we will see Pink Vest Lady turn around and dab him on the cheek, appearing to leave a shiny mark on his cheek. You be the judge. A little dab will do ya. Back to an early Thorndike photo. I just want to point out that this photo shows us Pink Vest Lady's position on the scene a few seconds after the pyrotechnic display, and also shows us the position of her husband, Bob the Builder. He is standing across the street. After their work was done, Bob and Pinky walked all the way up Boylston Street together, from the finish line to the next cross street. You can see them coming up at the left in this video clip. Then, after all that walking, they decided to give her a photo op as an injured victim, so they went up past the medical tent a bit and then put her into a wheelchair and rolled her into the medical tent from there. This is in slow motion, by the way. On the aerial photo displayed at the bottom, the green arrow shows us where they walked all the way up Boylston Street from the finish line, and the blue arrow shows us where they took the video of her in the wheelchair turning the corner into the medical tent. Pink Vest Lady, you're fired. Now back to the subject of magic blood powder, which is activated by water or clear glycerin. If such an effect was in use, we should expect to see some more footage of clear liquid going around the stage soon after the pyrotechnic display. So, in regards to this, I'd like to mention this little crew of 3 people who walk onto the stage less than a minute after the pyrotechnic display with water bottles in hand. We see them quickly go from crisis actor to crisis actor, momentarily bending over them, before quickly walking away, with their fingers on the lids of the water bottles they are holding. Let's follow them. Okay, here they are coming in at less than a minute after the pyrotechnic display. I should mention that even before that time, the stage crew was already discriminating who was allowed onto the stage and actively kicking unwanted people out, as indicated by the blue arrow. Okay, so here's a video clip of the water bottle crew coming onto center stage. There they are at the right. Here they come in. I put it to slow motion, but I'll bring it up to speed. There they are. There they go, each bending over a crisis actor. From another angle. Oh, and now he's back up already. He was just saying hi. There they are, with water bottles in one hand and another hand on the lids of the bottles. Back to the video. Well, as long as the camera moves up here, this is a good time to point out that the flags and the poster on the pole in front of Ground Zero were completely unscathed by the alleged shrapnel. Not a mark. Okay, the guy walks out by the front holding his water bottles. The gals hang around the back of the scene. We see him a few minutes later up on the street with the crew and blue gloves on. This lady stays up at center stage with her hand on the water bottle lid. She's got herself blue gloves on. Now we see she has actually stepped in between Dr. Panter and Carlos and is directly over Jeff. Maybe she could just reach back and grab that wheelchair as soon as possible. This is a couple minutes later. She is now leaning over another crisis actor, butting in front of the medical staff. And now she's chatting with a cop. And that's that. The water bottle crew are circumstantially noteworthy in relation to the issue of blood powder activated by clear liquid, which is an effect that is commonly used in disaster exercises. It's just one more thing worth pointing out if we are going to suggest that this effect was in use that day. No more than that, no less than that. Moving on, here's a group of friendly crisis actors on the morning before the marathon. They played victims at the first site. Several members of this gang, including the photographer, talk quite a bit in blogs and interviews about faith in God and love and forgiveness, and they also quote scripture. This might be a good time to talk more about what could have motivated the crisis actors who participated in the Boston unbombing. As mentioned, I believe that they are the victims of sophisticated con artists. Judging from various headlines, I would say that they were sold all kinds of ideas that might sound good to a progressive-minded person. For instance, the idea that their participation would result in securing more funding for disaster preparedness programs and homeland security programs, and for the needs of hospitals and police departments and fire departments. And the idea that the event itself was going to help various departments and infrastructures be better prepared for the real thing. A surprising number of the crisis actors who participated have police officers in the family, and that might explain something about the recruiting, because police officers really do put their lives in danger on a regular basis. And the Boston bombing script, especially the search and apprehension of the suspect in Watertown, was used to highlight the needs of police for more funding and training and advanced equipment, which were some of the things coming from Department of Homeland Security grants and other programs then under threat of budget cuts. Remember the 2013 budget crisis called the sequestration? Budget cuts related to Homeland Security and law enforcement were a big issue. Many were predicting a dire impact on police departments. After the Boston so-called bombing, many people were saying that the event proved the need for all kinds of funding and grants to police, including grants for the kind of militarization that so many other people found very alarming. You might not remember, but the budget sequestration was kind of the end of the world. Flooding the streets with cocaine, setting back medical science for a generation, killing puppies in kennels, being mean to the LGBT community, messing up the environment, warming Greenland to temperatures not seen since the Middle Ages, causing obesity, making towns in California bleed, being a mental health crisis. Well, that one might actually be true. But to refocus, just 3 days before the unbombing, congressional committees were debating whether claims of dire impacts of sequestration and budget cuts to Homeland Security were just scare tactics. 3 days later, the debate changed. The point is that there are plausible explanations for what could have convinced our crisis actors to participate in the unbombing hoax. There are all kinds of reasons. If you're a progressive in favor of gun restriction, then there's a gun control aspect to the larger Boston bombing script. And then there's a variety of personal causes for particular actors. The cause of helping financially challenged amputees get new prosthetic limbs. The cause of service dogs for disabled people. Who doesn't love furry friends? The cause of helping military families coping with the loss of fallen loved ones. Lots of causes. But the sad reality is that our crisis actors have all been totally conned. Well, who knows? Some of them may have done it just to get out of some trouble with the law, or maybe just because they needed or wanted some money. But whatever convinced them to participate, I wonder how many of our crisis actors were surprised to hear our president and leaders of both major U.S. political parties invoking the Boston bombing to justify a policy of continual war and mass destruction and mass murder and mayhem in the Middle East, all under the pretext of fighting a masquerading terrorist threat unceasingly dangled before our eyes. I wonder how our crisis actors feel about the direct way that war profiteers have used the Boston unbombing and other false flag events to further a script of endless wars and proxy wars half a world away. Never forget, ISIS is coming, with booby traps and explosives. But someone at home is profiting from this fear, all right. Defense contractors. The government and the criminal financial cartels just love so-called defense spending. Invest now. Get in and win. These guys are all cheering for the dramatic rise in Lockheed Martin stocks after the latest false flag terrorist attack. Lockheed stock and 2 loaded barrels. Of course, those expensive weapons will be put to good use, ensuring that only regimes are in place who are willing to work with the financial partners of the United States and the EU. We don't want the wrong people controlling astronomically profitable gas pipelines and oil reserves in the Middle East. You won't read about it in the mainstream media, but as this article written by a Greek geopolitical analyst in 2013 notes, the United States was quite insulted when Syria favored a gas pipeline deal with Russia and Iran over proposals made by the United States and associates. About a day later, Hillary Clinton called for regime change in Syria. Why do you think Russia is now in Syria defending the Syrian government? As for the home front, perhaps our crisis actors weren't thinking about how authoritarians at home would use this and other false flag events to further a script of more fear, more suspicion, more surveillance, more police state, and more restrictions upon our liberties. But once you sign that non-disclosure agreement, you are seemingly legally entrapped, and perhaps they were told how serious the repercussions would be should they ever break the agreement. Well, we all know how Obama loves whistleblowers. But really, the American people do love and appreciate whistleblowers. So I think our crisis actors should just come clean, and all will be forgiven. I also want to briefly talk about all the doctors who participated in this hoax and lied through their teeth. I feel pretty confident that these doctors signed on for the very same reasons as Nurse Betty and the crisis actors. Perhaps signed on are the wrong words, and it might be more accurate to say that they were entrapped, insofar as they may have been deceptively reeled in without realizing the full scope of what was agreed upon, until after they'd agreed. Of course they still knowingly chose to lie, which was wrong, but this hoax wasn't their idea to begin with. This hoax originated deep in the delusional echo chamber of some quasi-governmental think tank, and there are some real sociopaths running around those places. The military-industrial complex and the criminal financial cartels thrive on deception and lies. When was the last time a war was started without a lie? The Gulf of Tonkin lie? The Iraqi soldiers throwing babies out of incubators lie? The weapons of mass destruction lie? The lie that Libyan leader Muammar Gaddafi was sending out rape squads supplied with Viagra? The lie that Syrian President Bashar al-Assad launched a poison gas attack on his own people? The lie that Russia had destabilized Ukraine, when in reality the US and NATO had armed and funded a bunch of neo-Nazi mercenaries to overthrow the legitimate government of Ukraine? Okay, shifting gears. Now we're going to do just one more in-depth focus following one particular crisis actor and the attempts of the stage crew to handle her script malfunction. The scene coordinator giving the stay out hand signal here is giving the gesture to the woman with the white towel wrapped around her right leg. Her name is Marilyn Kite. The official story is that shrapnel from the alleged bomb tore a monstrous hole in the back of her thigh, and that she was bleeding so bad when the paramedics got to her that they thought she might have severed an artery. This photo from Ha Ha Tango shows us what she really looked like before the paramedics got to her. Boy, does she not look injured. Let's read more about her alleged injuries. The Boston Globe's interview with Marilyn's husband and family relates that Marilyn had a hole the size of her fist in the back of her thigh, and needed 2 surgeries and would be needing, at the time of this article, plastic surgery in the future to repair her thigh. USA Today's interview with Marilyn and her family relates that Marilyn received more than 30 stitches in her leg, which also suffered from burns. The Record Searchlight's interview with Marilyn relates that there was a lot of blood, and that because she was bleeding so much, paramedics thought that the shrapnel that tore through her leg might have severed an artery, and relates that the wound was so bad that she is just fortunate to have survived. Here's the 2 Ha Ha Tango photos that show the back of her leg clearly. A closer look. Given those injury reports, it appears there has been a wardrobe malfunction. The back of her leg should be a bloody mess. The white towel around her leg looks clean, and her calf and ankle are as clean as a whistle, showing no sign of any blood pouring down or having poured down from her alleged wound. Now, assuming that all the crisis actors were supplied with some kind of fake blood squibs or blood packets, and she did manage to put some kind of blood squib or device under the white towel on her leg or under her pants, then there's clearly been a wardrobe malfunction, because these pictures are just completely incongruous with the reported severity of her wounds. Let's follow her. In the manifold official story of this event, it is often clear that any given official story is the result of some after-the-event tweaking in order to account for any incongruities captured on camera. And so the official story of Marilyn is incongruous from the get-go in relating that Marilyn was several dozen feet away from the blast when it happened, which puts a whole bunch of people standing between her and the alleged bomb. Perhaps she was supposed to be closer, but the official story tries to follow the visual footage, and the visual footage of the immediate aftermath shows a bunch of crisis actor victims inside a ring of uninjured standing people, and Marilyn was not inside that ring. The first we see of Marilyn is 43 seconds after the pyrotechnic display. The blue arrow is pointing at her. She is stepping out of the Sweet Green Cafe. Here's a close-up of that last slide. The next we see of Marilyn in the Ha Ha Tango photos, she's still standing there at 1 minute and 16 seconds after the pyrotechnic display, and about to walk down to center stage. At 1 minute and 27 seconds, she begins making her way down to center stage. Here she is 2 seconds later. Here's a short clip of her passing by at 1 minute and 43 seconds after the pyrotechnic display. Keep your eye under the blue arrow. This photo captures 1 minute and 57 seconds after the pyrotechnic, and Marilyn is just nearing center stage. Now I'm going to point out a scene coordinator who has just come onto the stage with a group of officials and crew members. She is under the red arrow in this photo, and you can only see the top of her head, but you'll see her in the next slide. As she was just coming onto the stage, this scene coordinator almost immediately noticed Marilyn walking by towards center stage. A few seconds later, we see the scene coordinator looking at Marilyn. She may be gawking at how ridiculous that white towel looks around Marilyn's clearly uninjured leg. The orange arrow points to our friend Ginger, the redhead in the blue tank top, whose main task is to block the view, but she's also involved in getting unwanted people off the stage. This photo shows us 9 seconds after the previous photo. Now the scene coordinator has recruited Ginger, and together they are walking towards Marilyn. Okay, and now a few words about this scene coordinator. As mentioned, in large disaster response exercises, the people performing the tasks of directors and scene coordinators, or as these tasks are described in the manuals, evaluators, controllers, facilitators, etc., are generally people in the field of emergency response, and such is the case with our scene coordinator. She is a Hingham, Massachusetts firefighter and paramedic named Caitlin Shinney. A paramedic is a level of certification beyond basic EMT, requiring much more advanced training and study and testing. She is a highly skilled medical professional. Okay, that said, from the moment of the last photo we saw, here is video footage of our paramedic scene coordinator and Ginger walking towards Marilyn. Okay, now they have arrived at Marilyn. And here's another photo that chanced to capture Ginger and the scene coordinator as they were walking towards Marilyn. This video footage briefly captures 4 seconds after they've arrived at Marilyn. Keep your eye on the upper left corner of the screen. In this video clip, which begins at 2 minutes and 26 seconds after the pyrotechnic display, we see Ginger escorting Marilyn off of the scene and a cop literally pushing Marilyn away, pointing in the direction of away, which is the opposite direction of the medical tent and of the throng of medical staff and trained medical first responders at center stage. Okay, one more time. Keep your eye on the upper left. A different camera very briefly captures Ginger walking Marilyn off of the scene a second later. Now what happened is just not right. They should not be pushing Marilyn away and walking her away. In fact, they shouldn't be letting Marilyn walk at all, not one step. Our scene coordinator should know this as a highly trained professional paramedic. Just for confirmation, here's the state of Massachusetts emergency treatment protocols. Quote, "Do not allow injured patients to walk or otherwise exert themselves." Unquote. A few seconds later, we see Ginger walking back, but as we shall see, Marilyn has also turned around and decided to stand at the outskirts of the scene. And here's the scene coordinator in the red shirt giving that stay out hand gesture. Get her out of here. Which they do. The next we see of Marilyn, they have moved her a bit further down the block and off to the side. We also see the female scene coordinator directly in front of her, still gawking at Marilyn and still discussing the situation on the phone. This picture is 3 minutes and 11 seconds after the pyrotechnic display. As with most of the crisis actors on the stage, Marilyn is part of a little group of relatives or friends, all with their own related scripts. The man to the right of her is her ex-husband Frank, according to the official story, and her son-in-law Scott is up near center stage, Purple Arrow. As we shall see, the crew are going to make Marilyn walk all the way down the block to sit in a doorway by the corner, before they actually make her get up and walk again. Next we see of her is 3 minutes later. Here it is over 6 minutes after the pyrotechnic display. She's in the doorway, and we see a Boston EMS paramedic in a fluorescent yellow and black jacket and a marathon volunteer bringing a stretcher board. We can tell what time it is by this little crew in the video. Ha Ha Tango caught this same group a second later running together at that same spot. Here it is just over 6 minutes and 30 seconds after the pyrotechnic display. At the top of this photo we can also see Carlos and Jeff wheeling off past the finish line. Another photographer also caught the scene we just saw at the corner doorway from another angle. This is the next we see of Marilyn, and the last we see of her in the Ha Ha Tango sequence. Now it is over 9 minutes after the pyrotechnic display. Since she was brought to that doorway, the paramedics have wrapped a large medical bandage around her leg, and we also see a belt tourniquet over her leg. I don't know where the paramedic went, but there is a stretcher board on the ground next to her with the words Boston EMS on it. Her ex-husband Frank is long gone in a wheelchair. This is a close-up of the same photo. Note that the ground is wet with water, which is clear by looking at the gray grout between the bricks. If it was blood, then the gray brick grout would be stained red. We see that her leg and her sneakers are completely clean and there is no blood anywhere. If the official story of her injuries were true, it would be completely unthinkable for a paramedic to allow her to get up and walk anywhere from this spot. Just for confirmation, here is the state of Massachusetts emergency treatment protocols. Quote, "Do not allow injured patients to walk or otherwise exert themselves." And they're making her get up. And there with her are our friends Frick and Frack, who visit the crisis actors that the medical professionals ignore. And up around center stage there's a huge throng of medical staff, mostly just standing around doing nothing. The yellow tape was put across the finish line at a little over 9 minutes after the pyrotechnic display. I see a couple of cameramen standing ready. Don't tell me they're going to make Marilyn go walking for a photo op with Frick and Frack. And against the most basic medical responder protocols, the paramedics and the crew have Marilyn up and walking again. This photo was taken by a Boston Globe photographer, apparently for file under Tales of Heroism. Not only should they have moved her from the doorway on a stretcher, or at least a wheelchair, but they should never have made her walk all the way down the block in the first place. First Responder 101 is to not make the injured person walk. What more can I say? They're all fired. And now we've reached our last Boston crisis actor. He is far from the last crisis actor at the Boston unbombing with a story that can be easily exposed, but he's the last that I'm going to cover in this presentation for the sake of time. His name is Steve Byrne. He was at the second pyrotechnic site. This is a photo of him shortly before the pyrotechnic display at the second site. He said his clothes were burnt off of him, so let's just make a note of his clothes. Let's watch a bit of an interview with Steve.
I was bleeding heavily. My clothes were burnt off of me. I could see my injuries and wounds. I knew it was serious, but at the same time, it was more stay calm, help yourself, obviously, and just, you'll get through it and don't panic. Turn to the right, turn to the right.
And one more interview.
Right where you see the picture where they show the backpack in the mailbox, that's exactly where we were.
So you were if you're facing the mailbox, you were to the right of it?
Just to the left of it, they were to the right of it, okay. So that's why they suffered the,
So the shrapnel that hit you is shrapnel that came over the mailbox?
Came over as BBs, nails. That's what they, my friend had 70 nails in his leg. And
70 nails?
70 nails. And, I have BBs. There's still one in my neck that the doctors couldn't take out because it's too close to my nerves to control my vision. And most of them in my face came out, due to the surgery and stuff like that. And just burns. I mean, it burnt the clothes right off of us. It was
really, your clothes were actually burned off?
Burned right off of us.
So a nerve in his neck controls his vision. They should have kept him in the hospital for further testing. Okay, here's a look at the front of Steve about a minute and a half after the pyrotechnic display. His clothes are definitely not burned off of his body, or burned at all for that matter, and there is no evidence that he is or was bleeding heavily or bleeding at all. His nice white shirt would be bloody if he was or had been bleeding heavily. Let's follow Steve from the moment of the pyrotechnic display to here. Here he is about 13 seconds after the display, standing in the street. Next we'll see a video clip. He's under the blue arrow. In this video clip, to which I've added photos, we'll see he makes his way on the street past the mailbox and past some fake heroes in action. There he is. No burned clothes. No blood on that nice white shirt. Looking good. We see the front of him looking clean as a whistle. Keep on walking. The guy in the blue hands him something. Maybe his paycheck. What he really needs is a fake blood squib. Sorry about that resolution change. The guy in the blue pushes him off to some other plainclothes handlers who escort him to the door. Alright, so that's that. And here's the next we see of Steve, the photo I already showed you. Now the crew has moved him to a doorway to the right of center stage. The girl in the black shirt and the black pants next to him is a crew member. Here we see her touching his face, perhaps applying some fake blood. Who knows? Next we see a fire truck has pulled up to the crosswalk, so we know that this is sometime later than the previous photo. On the left side of this slide is a short video clip in which we see that Steve walks away from the crew member woman out towards the street a bit, and she raises her camera to take his picture. There he goes. Smile, Steve. At the right is a photo that shows her taking Steve's picture. An odd little photo op. Why no medical responders attending to Mr. Byrne? What is for certain is that Steve lied when he said that his clothes were burned off of his body and that he was bleeding heavily from wounds that required surgery. If anything, Steve's pants should have been on fire when he was giving his interviews in the days after the event. Before continuing, I want to briefly repeat something I already said, which is that the crisis actors involved in this event are the victims of sophisticated con artists. Many of them are actually using their roles in this event to promote various good causes. As featured on this slide, Cowboy Carlos is using his role to promote the same work he was involved in before the Boston unbombing, which is to help military families coping with loss. And Carlos should know, he lost one son in Iraq and another to suicide. One can see how Carlos could be vulnerable to exploitation in his state of grief. Speaking of exploitation, children are an age-old tool in psychological warfare. I refuse to engage the official story that a child was killed at the Boston so-called bombing, not because I don't know for a fact that the entire event was faked and that no one was harmed, but because the story behind that story may be very sad and may involve the exploitation of a real tragedy. There are many situations in life where the unknowns are best left to God's good time in due season. So now we're moving on. Now we're almost to the end of the Boston unbombing section of this presentation, and I have a question. What about these two ladies, whom so many people gleefully and unquestioningly dragged through the mud after the Boston unbombing? These two women, the aunt and the mother of the Tsarnaev brothers, were in the days after the Boston unbombing very publicly calling attention to fairly widely circulating claims that the event was actually a staged hoax. I can't see why the masterminds of this hoax would have intended for these two ladies to be doing this, because I don't see how it could possibly have helped and not harmed the task of keeping the hoax hidden from the public. Of course there are all kinds of possibilities, but my first suspicion is that these two ladies were not in on it. Which leads me to wonder if the Tsarnaev brothers, the so-called bombers, were in on it. Were they just members of the crew all along and are now sipping daiquiris on a tropical beach in Chechnya? Or were they unwitting patsies, set up and framed and then hunted down, leaving one dead and one sentenced to death? I don't know, but it seems certain that if the Tsarnaev brothers were just innocent framed patsies, then such a fact would be kept hidden from the many progressive-minded participants in this hoax. It would be easy enough to con that crowd. But I don't know. I raise the suspicion that the brothers were innocent patsies because I know that there are some serious psychopaths and sociopaths down in the U.S. deep state, crawling along a criminal web extending through various governmental agencies and military channels and headquarters of financial cartels and corporate conglomerates. Making use of patsies and lying and murdering is everyday work for such criminals, not to mention unleashing hellish chaos upon entire nations. Often when we hear about some people hating our freedom, what they really hate is our CIA and State Department. But I digress. The unbombing trial was concluded in 2015 with a death sentence for Jahar Tsarnaev. I'm suspicious of whether the guy at the trial was even him. I've seen interviews where some of his friends say that the guy at the trial had a different accent and even looked different. So who knows if it was him, or if he is even alive, or a bunch of other possibilities. But it seems significant to me that his aunt, Marit Tsarnaeva, submitted an affidavit with the assistance of an attorney from Minnesota to the presiding judge of the trial for file as an official memorandum. The judge denied the request, but stated that the submitted materials would be maintained at the clerk's office. The record of this motion is at the top of this slide. Below that is the beginning of the affidavit, which seeks to prove Jahar's innocence. Pause if you want to read it. I put a link at the bottom if you want to read the whole thing. For starters, the Aunt Marit affidavit notes a discrepancy between the backpack shown by the FBI and the backpack worn by Jahar, as shown by surveillance video. At the left, we see the alleged bomb backpack behind the barricade. The top of it is white, but the back of it, including the back pocket, is black. And in the surveillance video frame, we see that the primarily white backpack worn by Jahar Tsarnaev just doesn't match. At the bottom right is the FBI photo of the exploded backpack that they allege Jahar placed on the ground. You'd think that they would at least get their fraudulent evidence right, but the FBI photo appears to show a primarily black backpack marked with a white rectangle. Aunt Marit made no mention of the black and tan craft operatives at the marathon wearing black backpacks marked with white rectangles, but I included a picture of one of these black and tan mercenaries at the scene because their presence is significant. The affidavit also offers Marit's first-hand account of veiled threats by the public defender team, who, along with people identifying themselves as independent investigators and social workers, visited the Tsarnaev brothers' parents and relatives overseas on several occasions. Marit says she was present when the team told the parents that if they did not cooperate with the team, then, quote, Jahar's life in custody would be more difficult, unquote, and that following further meetings with the parents at which Marit was not present, the parents were convinced to cooperate wholeheartedly with the team and to encourage Jahar to do the same. Elsewhere, the affidavit calls Jahar's confession into question, citing the historically long-standing legal opinion that extrajudicial confessions obtained without adequate safeguards are often worthless. In the words of Sir William Blackstone, quote, ever liable to be obtained by artifice, false hopes, promises of favor, or menaces, unquote. In other words, who knows if they deceived or drugged or tortured Jahar Tsarnaev, or if they threatened to harm his sisters living in Hackensack? Who knows? All I know for sure is that the Boston so-called bombing was a totally staged and faked event from head to toe. I could go on for another 2 hours with much more evidence exposing the Boston unbombing as a complete hoax, but I've already provided more than enough evidence for any critical thinker to conclude the fact. People suffering from advanced cognitive dissonance are not my problem, because I know that it's not about evidence for them, and even if I went out of my way to make a 5-hour presentation for those people, it would just amount to banging my head against the wall that has nothing to do with rationality. So, we've arrived at part 2, a brief overview of recent events and some closing thoughts. The words of Vietnamese monk Thich Nhat Hanh, who has been standing up to the anti-spiritual ideology of statism for many decades. In order to rally people, governments need enemies. They want us to be afraid, to hate, so we will rally behind them, and if they do not have a real enemy, they will invent one in order to mobilize us. Over the past several years within the United States and Europe, there has been a series of terrorist attacks which have been increasing in frequency. This list of attacks includes the Woolwich London attack, the Charlie Hebdo in Paris attack, the Bataclan in Paris, San Bernardino, California, Brussels, and the Orlando, Florida Pulse Club, which is the most recent as of this presentation. Knowing what we know, we should be suspicious of each event. I can tell you that I know with complete certainty that Charlie Hebdo, San Bernardino, Brussels, and Orlando were staged fake events. It's beyond the scope of this presentation to examine each of these in depth, but I think it would be very worthwhile for me to provide some clear evidence regarding Orlando, since it is the most recent hoax, and from there you can do your own homework about them all, if you feel the need. We'll start our Orlando investigation with a look at the street. The article at the top tells us about a man who reportedly took some video at 2:30 a.m. of the general pandemonium and also of some victims being taken from the Pulse Club. In the article we see his apartment from where he took the video. On the bottom we have a street view. We see his apartment on the right, which I've marked with a blue star. Notice that on the left side the closest building is marked Yoga, so we'll call that the yoga studio. Past the yoga studio there's a distinctive pink building with a white stripe on which the business name Stand Up MRI is written. Past that is a parking lot. Past that parking lot is Dunkin' Donuts. Past the Dunkin' Donuts is a cross street. And past the cross street there is another parking lot. And then there is the Pulse Club. I put a pink star above the Pulse Club sign. Now here's some of the video taken from the man's apartment window. You can see the round pink Pulse Club sign in the distance. He will turn his camera to the left and film victims being carried on the street in front of the yoga studio, which is over 100 yards away from the Pulse Club, and we will see that they are walking towards the Pulse Club. Here they come, carrying a victim in red shoes. There's the stand-up MRI building. And they're walking towards the Pulse Club from 100 yards away. But they're supposed to be fleeing the Pulse Club. Houston, we have a problem. This slide features frames of videos taken by another cameraman positioned across from the Dunkin' Donuts. And what do we see? We see that all of these victims who were supposedly being helped away from the Pulse Club are actually walking towards or being carried towards the Pulse Club from 100 yards away. How stupid can this hoax get? Let's find out. We already saw this victim in the red shoes being carried in the video filmed from the apartment. Now we see his friends carry him past the next camera. From 100 yards away, they are carrying him towards the Pulse Club, which is at this time an active shooter scene. Let's watch. Okay, so he's supposedly shot in the leg. And they're carrying him to the active shooter scene from 100 yards away. Once they're at the corner and think the camera is no longer on them, they put the victim down to stand on his own 2 feet. He gives his buddy in the black shirt a gay little shove. We'll play that last part again. Put the victim down to stand on his own 2 feet, a little shove, and a big cheerful grin. Because it really is a joke. Next we'll take a look at this fellow, who was reportedly shot in both hips, and is here seen fleeing towards the Pulse Club from 100 yards away. On the right we see a few photos of him giving interviews, obviously the same guy. In interviews he said that he was shot in both hips while hiding in the bathroom and was eventually taken out of the club by police, in which case he shouldn't be seen here walking with a police escort towards the Pulse Club from 100 yards away. Let's start with an interview in which he describes his escape from the Pulse bathroom. Watch the middle right. Okay, White Pants, that's him.
I had to step over bodies that already passed out and climbed onto the sink to then climb over. At that point, I put my hands in the air, waved them to the cops. They came, got me, and just brought me straight out to a stretcher in an ambulance.
Okay, to give Norman's whole account, he says that he ran into a bathroom and hid in a stall with a group of people, and then the shooter, Omar Mateen, followed into the bathroom and kept shooting people, shooting Norman twice, once in each hip. And then the shooter stepped out of the bathroom and into the bathroom next door, and Norman and the group in the stall laid still for a while, before Norman finally decided to sneak out of the bathroom and was met by a group of police with flashlights who took him out an exit door and laid him on the ground. For starters, obviously his story is a lie because we see footage of him walking towards the club from 100 yards away. That's all we need to see to know that his story is bullshit. But the finer details of his story also contradict the official story. For starters, the ridiculous footage of him walking towards the Pulse Club was taken between 2:30 and 3 a.m. But the official story is that after Omar Mateen went into the bathroom, the police, who were not in tactical protective gear, retreated and left the response in the building to the SWAT team, who didn't enter until breaking through a wall after 5 a.m. Norman says that Mateen eventually walked out of the bathroom that Norman was in, so if the cops did not shoot Mateen when he did that, then the cops were gone by the time Norman stepped out of the bathroom. Again, according to the official story, from the time Mateen went into the bathroom area, there was no groups of cops with flashlights in the building bringing people out of the exit doors. That did not happen until after SWAT broke through a wall and killed Mateen after 5 a.m. The most police reportedly did was to remove an air conditioner out of a dressing room window and help some people escape through there. Of course, the whole official story is a lie. My point is that Norman can't keep his lies straight with the official lies. There are other glaring discrepancies in Norman's interviews which I won't cover here. Really, every interview with any Pulse survivor is full of discrepancies and bizarre observations. Like this guy's bizarre observation.
And then this other guy who was walking around with a bullet in his leg, and he had no idea it was sticking out. And the bullet, I kid you not, was about this big, the size of your finger. And he had no clue because of the adrenaline, and he was too busy looking for, I think, a family member who was still inside.
Good Lord. Moving on from stupid to sinister, the day after the Orlando Gay Club's so-called shooting, Hillary Clinton gave a speech in response. And what did she call for? More bombing of the Middle East, particularly of Iraq and, you guessed it, Syria, where she says we need to be, quote, ramping up the air campaign. The fact is that this minion of Satan has been directly orchestrating a horrendous proxy war of regime change in Syria since 2011. For just one example, I've included at the top right a BBC headline about her April 1, 2012 speech in which she unequivocally stated that, quote, Assad must go. And at the bottom right is a Washington Post report of her calling for more airstrikes on Syria in 2013. The fact is that the United States has been waging war on Syria since 2011. Until 2014, this was primarily executed through a coalition of Arab dictatorships with advanced weaponry supplied by the United States, and through a so-called Syrian rebel army, mostly comprised of foreign mercenaries, which was put together by the CIA and the State Department, and said coalition of Arab dictatorships, whom Hillary Clinton calls our partners in the region. Direct U.S. airstrikes on Syria officially began in 2014, with Hillary Clinton's enthusiastic endorsement, and now she wants more. Sad to say, the 2016 presidential prospects are altogether dire. Donald Trump has also called for more airstrikes abroad in the wake of the Orlando false flag. We can give Trump some credit for opposing the Obama and Clinton regime change agenda in Syria, because the real driving force of the entire war there is a foreign orchestrated regime change. But Trump is merely being a populist. The American people hate regime change and proxy wars and war in general. I see no evidence that Trump has what it takes to seriously stand up against the military-industrial complex, or to seriously roll back government authoritarianism. As Ron Paul succinctly observed, Trump is almost the opposite of a libertarian. I would add that Hillary Clinton is completely the opposite. Terrorism is not the direct connection between Orlando and the Boston bombing. The connection is that when they want popular support for war, they launch false flags. Gun restriction is just a secondary objective of Orlando, and of San Bernardino for that matter. After the San Bernardino false flag attack, President Obama pointed directly to the Boston so-called bombing in a speech ending with a sales pitch for authorization for all the bombing he'd been doing without authorization. Quote, "We see growing efforts by terrorists to poison the minds of people like the Boston Marathon bombers and the San Bernardino killers," unquote. And he closes with the sales pitch, quote, "Finally, if Congress believes as I do that we are at war with ISIL, it should go ahead and vote to authorize the continued use of military force against these terrorists," unquote. But we know who the number one terrorists are. The truth is that war on Syria was decided on the day Syria declined a major pipeline deal with the United States financial partners. The truth is that Islamic terrorist groups like ISIS are created and funded by Western globalist elites and used for the purposes of geopolitical control and financial profit. The whistleblowers who expose this truth are ignored by the mainstream media. To name just a few of these whistleblowers, Sibel Edmonds, Michael Springman, Robert D. Steele, and Scott Bennett. Look them up. As things stand, the false flags are ramping up, and so is the proxy war on Syria launched by Barack Obama, Hillary Clinton, and their globalist cohorts. The mainstream media won't even relay some of the more twisted statements coming from these war criminals, but the alternative media will. For example, when Syrian forces pushed the Islamist rebels out of the city of Palmyra in March of 2016, the U.S. Department of Defense spokesman said that Palmyra was now, quote, "out of the frying pan and into the fire," unquote, and from, quote, "being under the boot heel of ISIL to being under the boot heel of Assad," unquote, which is totally absurd, considering that anybody interested in religious tolerance should know that in Palmyra and throughout Syria, Christians and other minorities were practicing their religion openly and in peace before the U.S. coalition flooded the country with Islamist mercenaries. Saudi Arabia, on the other hand, has 0 Christian churches, and it is illegal to openly practice Christianity there. And yet Hillary Clinton calls the Saudis our partners in the region, and President Obama has personally authorized the sale of over $100 billion, billion with a B, dollars worth of weapons and fighter planes to the Saudi government, which are now being used to slaughter tens of thousands of innocent people in Yemen, and to supply depraved Islamist mercenaries in Syria and throughout the Middle East. I should also note that the Department of Defense spokesman went on in the same speech just quoted to repeat the same discredited lie pushed by Obama in 2013 as justification for his airstrikes on Syria, saying, quote, "Assad has gassed his own people with chemical weapons. He is the problem, right? He is responsible for this bloody civil war, right?" Unquote. To be thorough, let's just get the backstory on this gas attack claim. The claim was made in August 2013 by the Obama administration and top NATO officials that they had evidence that a disputed sarin gas attack in the town of Ghouta in Syria had been launched by Syrian President Bashar al-Assad, and not by the foreign U.S.-backed mercenaries who had recently flooded into Syria and were known by UN officials at that time to be in possession of sarin gas. As it turns out, Obama and NATO actually had no evidence, and the list of people who called bullshit on Obama's claims includes UN weapons inspectors, UN International Inquiry Commission members, a few brave U.S. Congress members and former ambassadors, a former director of the U.S. Congressional Task Force on Terrorism, a few brave British MPs, numerous Russian government ministers, a scathing study from the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, and far too many independent investigative journalists to mention here. Nonetheless, true to historical pattern, President Obama attempted to use this non-existent evidence to rally popular support for an impending U.S.-led bombing campaign on Syria. In an encouraging change of historical pattern, popular support was not forthcoming. In America as well as around the world, normal everyday people called bullshit on Obama. More importantly, normal everyday people in Syria called bullshit on Obama. Why? Because they had seen firsthand the depravity of the foreign mercenaries overrunning their country, and from day one of this U.S.-orchestrated proxy war, no group was more targeted and terrorized by the Islamist mercenaries than the Syrian Christian community, which is actually all the evidence that church leaders in Syria needed to call bullshit on Obama, which they did, from the Archbishop of Damascus on down to the local clergy. Now I want to say a few words in particular about this brave Syrian nun, Mother Agnes Miriam de la Croix, who also called bullshit on Obama's false claims of evidence that the Syrian government launched a chemical weapons attack. She lives in that region of Syria and knows the people and traveled to the town and talked to the people, and she gathered direct evidence that the attack was launched by rebels who then went on to stage faked scenes of dead children for maximum effect. Of course, the Western mainstream media prostitutes pounced on her like a pack of hyenas. Who the hell was she? She had no authority. She was no expert. What they also should have asked, to be consistent, is who the hell were the normal everyday Syrian people, Christian and Muslim alike, who were being terrorized by an invading army of Islamist mercenaries. I also want to mention another globalist propaganda piece about Syria. It's a BBC documentary called Saving Syria's Children, which was aired on the very day the UK House of Commons was voting on military intervention in Syria in late August 2013, and which has since been unequivocally exposed as fraudulent. Just in way of an overview, I'll mention that this BBC documentary is about an attack that actually never happened. Not only have the victims been exposed as bad actors wearing makeup, but the BBC was exposed for filming multiple takes of the same purportedly chaotic moments in the aftermath of this alleged attack, changing the dialogue from take to take. Also, it's been discovered that photos of this alleged attack were uploaded to the open-source journalism website Demotix a full day prior to the undisputed official date of the alleged attack, as reported by all who claim to have been present. I encourage you to research this documentary further. It's an all-around brazenly shoddy scrap of globalist propaganda. No wonder the public wasn't inflamed to support airstrikes on Syria. The UK Parliament didn't give poor Cameron his yes vote to regime change Syria. A taste of things and of Brexits to come. I wonder who even believes the globalist lunatics anymore. Oh, right, Bernie Sanders, the great lost hope of peace-loving progressives everywhere. Bernie supports airstrikes in Syria and what President Obama is trying to do there. Poor Bernie has been played for a useful idiot. What a shame that for some reason so many progressives have a hard time challenging the crimes and abuses of statism. Is it because so many progressives are so all good with using the state to force everybody to pay for progressives' ideas about how to run everyone's lives? It would actually be all good if the state would get out of managing our lives. And then we'd have so much more freedom to organize and create and patronize the healthcare modalities and schools of our own choosing, and the solutions of our own making. How can we find a solution to fossil fuels, for instance, if the youth are uniformly indoctrinated with the scientific dogma advanced by the people profiting from fossil fuels, and the wars being fought over fossil fuels, or rather so-called fossil fuels? How many brilliant young people have ever heard of primary water theory? If they did, they didn't hear it in a public school classroom. There's probably not one public school classroom in America where kids are being taught about the 20th century's most brilliant natural scientist, Victor Schauberger. I'm not saying the problem is teachers. Teachers are wonderful and deserve to be liberated. The problem is all the top-down restrictions and homogenization of teachers and students alike. It's high time for progressives to stop advocating for state control over the realms of creativity and ingenuity and compassion and charity. Don't mourn. Organize. Okay, now we're getting close to the end of this presentation. I want to play this video clip showing the kind of deception that technology is capable of these days. Watch how the guy at the top left moves the mouth of the Putin at the right. And this is just the publicly available technology. I'm sure this is quaint compared to the things they've developed and are working on in the black budget world. No doubt they can create media footage of anyone saying anything or doing anything anywhere. Make your annoying coworker pledge allegiance to ISIS. You get the point. We're living at a time when corrupt worldly powers are gaining much greater abilities to manipulate people's 3D 5-sense perception. While we need to take enough time to be aware of what they are up to, we don't really need to spend countless hours down any digital rabbit holes trying to expose them on their level. The way to defeat them is spiritual. Our higher senses are beyond the limited bandwidth of materialism. The spiritual path is the path of intuitive knowing and will lead us quickly to the real facts and to the real solutions. To get there, we have to move past the false solution of statism. The useful role of the state is very limited. Beyond that, it's just a drag and a menace. In the words of my favorite banjo player, Pete Seeger, quote, "Power-hungry people just seem to gravitate towards big organizations. Whether it's big government or corporations or big anything, big organizations can be corrupted by people who want to do dirt." Unquote. And another gem from Pete, quote, "I like to say I'm more conservative than Goldwater. He just wanted to turn the clock back to when there was no income tax. I want to turn the clock back to when people lived in small villages and took care of each other." Unquote. Me too, Pete. Very much so. And if we think about it, to when would that be? It would be to exactly the United States before the Progressive Era, my friends. That's when people took care of each other directly, and very naturally so. That's when communities of all sorts knew that charity and taking care of each other was our own sacred duty, and no one defined taking care of each other as the government stepping in and imposing massive taxes to fund monolithic governmental welfare programs. Uh-oh. Pete Seeger is turning red up there. I'm not trying to hold up Pete as some libertarian icon. I'm just bringing up Pete because I think he's a good example of a good person who remained open-minded and was able to reconsider things and evolve his perspective over time. In 1998, Pete gave a lovely talk at the National Press Club, much of it about his own evolution. Not that he publicly repudiated FDR, but his perspective certainly evolved over the years. At one point in this talk, Pete asks why all the government post offices couldn't accomplish what the one entrepreneur who started Federal Express accomplished. Good question. At one point he says, quote, "There is a great danger when you have an organization and people say, 'Oh, the government will pay for it.' Ha ha ha," unquote. And later he says, quote, "I have to confess that socialism as practiced anywhere in the world didn't work out so well," unquote. And my favorite quote, "There are reserves of genius all through this world, and they'll show up in all sorts of places," unquote. A man who said that is a man who believed in the inherent greatness of humanity. The problem with socialism as we know it is that socialism actually has a low regard for people. Socialists are so certain that people can't be counted on to manage any given arena of their own lives, be it healthcare or education or whatever, that socialists insist that the state must take control over that arena and put it into the hands of some governmental expertocracy. That's what socialism is. That's what globalism is. The recent Brexit vote was really all about saying no thanks to a bureaucratic cabal of central planners and an arrogant expertocracy. No thanks, we know how to run our own lives, and we know better than you how to take care of each other, believe it or not. And for all those who have been indoctrinated to equate progressivism with environmentalism, that includes taking care of the planet. God knows progressivism has not been good for the environment, and that unrestricted governments have generally been the worst stewards of the environment, when not polluting directly, then allowing their corporate cronies to pollute with impunity. On the other hand, limited governments that are simply focused on protecting property rights are a more reliable solution to pollution. Egregious pollution is always a violation of enough people's property rights to enough of a degree that it is clearly a law enforcement issue. The destruction of rainforests are best prevented when just governments recognize the property rights of indigenous tribes. Furthermore, we have a tradition of commonwealth. The United States was founded on the notion of commonwealth. No one has a right to trash the commonwealth. As for the actual technological solution to our current pollution-causing technology, government sure hasn't given us the solution, and government interference in education surely hasn't done so. Instead of all these government loans and grants which only funnel the minds of the youth into the dogmas of the homogenized expertocracy called academia, let's stop stifling the natural growth and spread of new and radical theories and lines of inquiry. I know Victor Schauberger had a theory for achieving technology that is efficient and doesn't pollute the environment. Comprehend and copy nature. Bernie Sanders' free tuition schemes were never going to introduce the youth to the whole world of exciting scientific inquiry and discovery and discourse beyond the walls of the crony capitalist system called academia. I say the day our disillusioned youth become disillusioned with progressivism is the day we start seeing real solutions. And here we are at the end of this presentation, for real. One last quote to calm my nerves. How many ideas have there been upon earth, in human history, which only 10 years earlier were unimaginable, and which suddenly appeared when their mysteriously appointed season arrived, to go spreading all over the earth. Fyodor Dostoevsky. I like this quote because it gives me hope that in the near future we could all be saying, remember just a few years ago when most people actually believed in the lies told by their statist leaders? Remember when people trusted in statism before we chose to trust ourselves and to build a world according to our own diverse dreams and ideals? Before just living on Earth was like going to the greatest party ever?